Volume 1. Book 1, Prologue. Prologue. Spring. It had always been a season that brought euphoria to the many races, transcending mere continents and planes of existence. Of course, there were exceptions even to that. The world had myriad planes, large masses of continents, and legions of races with billions upon billions of living creatures. Small they may each be, but in total they far exceeded what most presumed. The world was exceedingly complicated, so much so that even the gods couldn't understand all of it. Life and death were ever intertwined, the energy of the stars caught up in an incessant cycle of creation and destruction. The heavens too were intricate, a curtain of glittering stars hung open the boundless night sky, oblivious to the gazes of those beneath them. To some they represented hope, and to others annihilation. A few saw in them the transcendent stillness of ancient times, while others the natural movement of the laws of the world. To most people, the stars were emblems of the gods. To some sages, they represented planes, continents, and boundless assorted worlds. They were infinite, their destruction only foreseen by few. They would fall eventually, unseen by most of the beings that fell with them, oblivious to their own mortality until death came knocking upon their doors. Spring was also common, present in any random plane of existence. However, this specific plane had only 2 seasons. In spring all things grew vibrant as nature came back to life, and in autumn deathly silence enveloped the world as they went into hibernation. The prime material plane's laws dictated the seasons, having them cycle every 12 years. 3 suns hung high up in the sky, with huge white stars lining the horizon. The radiance of the suns and stars intermingled, strengthening each other so much that the stars could be seen clearly even in the day, just like the ring of colorful lights beyond that was the source of countless beautiful legends across the world. There was more than one continent in this plane made mostly of ocean, the carrier of life. 1/6 of the world was land, and from a bird's eye view the planet radiated a deep violet glow that was magnificent and enigmatic. 6 moons circled it, at least 3 visible each clear night. They all glowed in different colors, being the foundation of magic and civilization. Mountains, rivers, lakes, and forests littered continent, making for vibrant colors of their own. However, violet was still key, the largest and most important of them all. The majestic mountain ranges span 10,000 kilometers at minimum, with peaks higher than 10,000 meters common themselves. Cities of various sizes dotted the continent like stars. The most magnificent of them towered atop the tallest of peaks at 20,000 meters high and sharp as a blade. It was littered with spiraling skyscrapers, glowing with a metallic sheen. The thick violet of the world loomed around it, growing bright and dull as if it was breathing with life. At the center of this large city was a 3,000-meter-tall spire, emitting violet light from its violet tip that formed a splendid band around it. Atop this spire stood a majestic being, a well-built man above the waist with reversed joints at the legs leading to huge hooves. His blue skin did not tarnish his dignity, tens of tentacles waving along his cheek and chin with a life of their own. He was dressed in bizarre armor with a metallic sheen, certain parts of it like the shoulder pads actually integrated into his body. The man was old, time having left deep marks on his skin. Numerous runes floated around the room he was in, seemingly moving irregularly at first but following the orbit of the stars if one looked close. The 10-meter-tall wall in front of him was completely transparent, giving him a panoramic view of the outside world and the miraculous city atop the miles-tall mountain peak. From his position he could see the obvious arc of the horizon, and if one squinted hard enough they would feel like they were looking at the entire world. The aptly named overlooking hall was a place all the beings of the plane dreamed of standing in, its sky-piercing spire a holy land for the entirety of the continent, the Twilight Church. A light flashed in the hall to reveal a well-built young man, trudging forward with big steps as his hooves caused sparks with the metal floor. The hall vibrated with every heavy step he took, his enormous strength not contained even by his muscles, spilling out with every step he took as raging dark storms failed to stain his flawless armor. The youth rushed to the old man, kneeling down on a knee to say, "Shaman, my men won't be able to hold on long, please leave as soon as possible." The old man didn't reply, not taking any action as even the tentacles on his face seemed to droop down. He was still looking at the outside world through the wall, like nothing could distract him from the view. It was currently twilight, the most beautiful time in the world, where the noise and clamor of the day gave way to the faint violet sunset as 2 setting suns and 3 rising moons shared the sky. The horizon was a spectrum of color past what life could ever lay eyes on, bringing numerous legends to life. It was what gave the Twilight Church its name. And yet the twilight this time seemed to represent doomsday. Balls of light flickered throughout the mountain range, as pillars of fire spewed forth a thick, heavy smog that covered the skies, which extended as far as the naked eye could see. Numerous black dots in the sky flew across the mountains, chasing, knocking into each other. At times, some of these figures would fall to the ground while being set ablaze. The overlooking hall was trembling. The magic barrier was able to block the noises but not the vibration. A red sun suddenly occupied half the sky, the numerous large shadows meandering across the sky with ease under its light as if walking on flat ground. Far away they looked like nothing much, but up close one would notice that these creatures were as big as cities, with large fins that looked like sails connected to even bigger bodies. They were like the gargantuan ancient oceanic beasts people had heard of in folklore, and their size was purely inconceivable. These beasts swayed their bodies to let loose sheets of fire that covered entire cities. This was neither magic flame nor divine fire, radiating almost no heat but still able to burn anything. They were almost impossible to put out, wiping out city after city to the tune of grim, miserable screams. This fire could turn inanimate objects to ash, yet living creatures would be set alight for a long time, giving a painful slow death filled with anguish. Another cluster of red clouds appeared in the sky, only signifying the arrival of another ancient beast. Shadows rose from the mountain and charged towards it, but both the youth and the old man knew that the brave fighters of their clan were just giving their lives up in this fight against the never-before-seen enemy. Their strikes were valiant and fierce, but ultimately ineffective, many already burned by the fires before they even got close and fell from the skies. Flames, followed by spikes of ice and bolts of lightning, were shot forth from the ground. People who could attack at such great distances were well-known beings on the continent, and even if the spells looked small they had the strength to flatten an entire mountain range. The spells looked simple from a distance, but with names like Azure Roar, Void Smite, Blazing Binds, Dragon Breath, and Sundering Slash, each one of them was breathtakingly awesome. However, even such power was useless against these beasts, merely rippling out as a few mushroom clouds upon their bodies without doing any harm. The young lad was still kneeling on the ground, but he too lifted his head to look at the silent apocalypse outside. He'd felt the power of this enemy himself, having been amongst the brave warriors charging up into the sky but a few moments ago. He only survived due to his extraordinary strength, coming here to the overlooking hall instead of continuing. He did not lack the courage to fight to the death, but he had a greater responsibility he had to see through. When he spoke once more, his tone carried a faint trace of despair. "Shaman, only our strongest fighters can do any damage to these creatures, even the spells of our legendary mages and divine officials are useless. Even the strength of the gods doesn't help, our attacks are like ant bites. The gods have abandoned us." "Don't worry, we still have the divine beast," the shaman said slowly. But the young lad stopped mid-sentence, turning to look at the Armageddon once more. The earth quivered as a silver dragon rose out of a distant mountain range, a graceful beast who illuminated the surrounding mountains with its radiance. This beautiful creature was a divine beast in her peak form, the guardian of this plane. It was the frost dragon, Sarah. The growl of the dragon, who had defeated numerous other invasions in history, broke through even to the isolated overlooking hall as she flew towards an enemy's back, attacking with her claws, her horns, and her dragon breath. Even she looked minute next to the giants in the sky, but still this was the first time an enemy was injured from the start of the battle. The first enemy casualty of the apocalypse fell to the ground amidst an ocean of cheers from all across the continent. "But we only have one Sarah," the young lad said, so confident it could be considered blasphemy. The shaman just sighed. This youth was the most talented one in the past decade, his strength already at a legendary peak. He was the only one who'd been able to even survive a fight with these apocalyptic enemies, so his judgment wouldn't be wrong. The wrinkles on the shaman's body deepened, as if he'd aged decades in an instant. He shook his head and sighed heavily, causing a few tentacles to fall and turn to ash before hitting the ground. A pillar of pale gray light emerged in the horizon, connecting the earth to the sky where Sarah had eliminated her opponent. The frost dragon was trapped within the pole of light, struggling to get out of its grip, but she howled in pain as her wings were destroyed quickly, her body disintegrating into ashes. All that was left of this magnificent being was silver sand. "Let's go, shaman, we still have time. I can open a passage to another plane with my strength. As long as you're still alive, the legend of the Twilight Church will live on." Even now the youth had resolution in his voice. He didn't mention that opening a portal to another plane would require his life, his very soul. He knew that this was the last hope of this world. A bronze tome suddenly surfaced in the hand of the shaman, looking heavy and ancient. It filled the hall with an archaic aura, holding the history of the plane for the past billions of years. The Book of Eternity. The lad's eyes lit up with hope. He had almost forgotten that the shaman still had a divine weapon on hand. The shaman maintained his composure as he flipped the book open. An image appeared on the first page, the scene of Sarah struggling within that gray pillar of light. Even on pale yellow parchment, the image caused the hearts of those seeing it to quiver, as if depicting an indescribable despair. The young lad knew of the properties of the Book of Eternity. He only glanced at the image before focusing his attention on the shaman's hand, hoping he would turn to the next page soon. And so the shaman did. The page flipped silently, revealing what was behind it. But there were no new chapters after the fall of the Guardian. The young lad looked at the book in a daze, and his mind went blank. The harbingers of apocalypse outside the hall went up in flames, causing more pillars of light to appear that set the whole plane ablaze. That was how the sixth era had come to a close. That was the end. Spring. It had always been a season that brought euphoria to the many races, transcending mere continents and planes of existence, and this was even more true for the Norland continent, a beautiful, amazingly fertile, and incredibly vast land filled with mystery. The Evernight Forest was a beautiful gem in the jewel-studded fabric that was Norland. It wasn't the biggest or the most beautiful on the continent, but it was still bigger than it seemed, and there were rumors circulating that it hid multiple planes and the kingdom of the Silvermoon Elves. Rumors were rumors, however, and the elves themselves were the only race to have entered the plane to public knowledge. Any humans or others that had been inside were extremely discreet about it. A caravan with tens of carriages and more than 20 guards was crawling across the lands not far from Evernight Forest. The unhurried pace was something rare for merchants, who lived by the adage of time is money. Spring was the most beautiful season in the continent, a season that lifted spirits and brought joy. The warm breeze was interlaced with the scents of various seasonal flowers as it blew over the earth softly, carrying away the worries and fatigue of the travelers. The caravan wasn't very big, nor were their goods particularly heavy. The guards seemed too extravagant for it, made up completely of young men at the prime of their training, dressed in refined armors with neat weapons and superior saddles for their horses. It was evidence that they weren't to be trifled with, those with good equipment being good fighters as well in general. The owner of the guards didn't seem thrifty, outfitting such young men with such good equipment. This meant something, as money and power were intertwined on Norland. Those with experience could see that this caravan had goods from Evernight Forest, the flesh and fur of demonic beasts, various materials, and rare wood. The symbol of a branch upon the carriage was a mark of aristocracy, and scholars who studied the sigils of various houses would recognize the three quails at the center. The family running this caravan had at least 400 years of history, ancient enough, and had received merit in past wars. It wasn't extremely influential, but it wasn't declining either. The gear itself could make up for incompetency on the guards' part, so it caused the bandits eyeing them to rethink themselves. The profit from this battle wouldn't outweigh the bloodshed, and logic dictated that the glistening armor would affect their decision more than the actual ability of the guards. The caravan hadn't met any bandits yet in its travels. A teenage girl amongst the group yawned loudly as she looked around with lively eyes, saying with boredom, "It's so quiet. Why aren't there any bandits? Have they gotten smarter?" She was fitted up in an extravagant yet light suit of armor, her beautiful hazel hair pulled up into a ponytail. She had a look of childlike innocence to her, one that was marred by the 2 swords hanging at the side of her horse. An older-looking girl in plain robes smiled knowingly when she heard this. "Those who aren't smart have already been wiped out." "Haven't they?" The younger girl was rather indignant. "Aren't there any courageous bandits?" "The courageous ones die faster." This reply left her speechless. She pouted for a while, following up with, "I can never win you, Elena, but..." The girl named Elena was dressed in plain robes, the attire of acolytes and weaker mages. Her dark hair swayed freely behind her, a few strands tracing the sharp curve of her face as they landed on her chest. She didn't look outstanding, but her pure charisma was enough to attract attention. Elena evidently had a soft spot for the younger girl as she comforted her, bringing her spirits up again. The footsteps of a horse suddenly sounded from behind the caravan, immediately alerting the guards. Even if the carriage didn't stop, they prepared their weapons to strike. This may have been the territory of Viscount Axcar, who put in extra effort to eliminate bandits, but they were trained well enough to take nothing lightly. Thunderous thuds resounded from a horse's hooves as a rider emerged from the thick smoke. He looked rather brusque, with a head of messy hair kept at bay by a red cloth. There wasn't any shirt beneath his armor, only a bare muscular chest that was overgrown with thick hair. It was unknown whether the man was purely showing off or he really was that offhand, but the black horse he rode was also much larger than regular horses, quite obviously from the lineage of a demonic beast. He may have been one man on horseback, but he radiated an aura of 1,000 soldiers. The color drained from the guards' faces as the rival closed in on them. They tightened their grips on their swords, some even half-drawing them. These weapons shone brightly with magic enchantments, every single one more expensive than an entire carriage of normal demonic beast skin. Clang! The ponytail girl's swords rang as they flew automatically to her hands, her eyes shining as she pinned them on the approaching rider. "Bandit?" "Nonsense!" Elena stopped the excited girl, signaling her guards to give way. Several of them showed faces of dismay, but they all remained silent and followed orders. The rider sped past them as fast as lightning, a human and horse-like tiger and dragon that blew Elena's long, luscious hair into the wind. He dashed ahead of them for several tens of meters, but then suddenly stopped and circled in place, yelling towards the approaching caravan, "Hey, beautiful! I'm Gatton." He was gone as soon as he shouted the words, making it far away. The caravan was left in confusion. "Elena, was he trying to hit on you?" The younger girl said after being in a daze for a while. "He was talking about you, Sue." "No, he was looking at you," the girl wanted to continue, but a small whirlwind from the tip of Elena's fingers smacked her horse, sending her far ahead. All she could do was cry out reluctantly. Nothing much happened after this episode until the caravan reached the inn they'd booked at Ludwig Town, preparing to spend the night there. Ludwig Town was not huge in any sense. It had a road that linked the whole town together, and was only populated by a few hundred people, but due to its advantageous location in between the territories of Viscount Anziker and the Evernight Forest, it prospered in trade. There were countless inns and hotels in the town, as well as shops that sold weapons, magical tools, and the skin of magical beasts. The most popular of all, however, was the local liquor. The town came alive in the evenings, the breeze carrying the scent of food and alcohol. Dinner was a time when everyone could get some rest after a long day of work, and all the members of the caravan made their way to the lounge of the inn for that very reason. The restaurant of this inn was quite large, so their group didn't occupy much space amongst the other mercenaries and caravans. 3 wandering bards were giving a performance near the bar, 2 of them playing the guitar while the older one in the center playing the djem as he sang a poem about the heroic black rider, Alexander. His hoarse voice combined with the strong rhythm of the drum to add sentiment to the music, creating a unique charm to the passionate story he was telling. It probably explained why the audience was still captivated, despite having heard it more than enough times. The alcohol was down jar by jar, mixing into the bloodstream and rushing to the head. It seemed to make the rhythm of the drum even more alluring, even affecting Elena herself. Suddenly, the booming footsteps of a horse sounded outside the door, stopping right at the entrance to the inn. A well-built man entered the place, so big he had to duck to enter the door. He scanned the area, and his eyes lit up as he took big steps towards Elena and Sue, oblivious to the daggers shot at him from the eyes of the guards as he sat right beside the girls. He stared at Elena with a wide smile, as if the two of them were the only ones in the world. "Hey beautiful, we meet again. My name is Gatton." With a more clear view of him, the man seemed rather brusque, a show-off with iron-forged muscles. Despite the thick needle-like mustache on his face, he was noticeably young. His eyes were two emerald orbs, seeming more alive the longer one stared at them. The tan man had a faint red scar that extended from the corner of his eye to the left side of his cheek, fairly new yet not ruining his looks at all. The scar instead added a pinch of manliness to him. The armor he wore was nothing high-level, and already had some wear and tear. Sue's eyes lit up as she glared at Gatton. "Bandit? Adventurer?" Lame. Sue was evidently disappointed at Gatton's answer, but she continued to ask, "So why are you stalking us?" Gatton smirked and pointed to Elena. "Because I like her." "Ah, a lecher I see." Sue did not bother hiding the disappointment in her face. Elena sat quietly, but the clattering armor of the man alerted many of her guards. Most of them had pulled their swords out. The aura of the guards changed the moment the swords were out of their sheaths, as they gave off a biting and murderous vibe. The temperature in the restaurant lowered instantaneously, and the mercenaries who were previously making noise also quieted down as they looked over at the commotion. They had been adventuring long enough to understand what was going on, and, though these guards were not experts, they had taken lives before. Their skills far exceeded their young looks. Elena furrowed her brows and looked at Gatton with her light blue eyes, not avoiding his fiery stare. The guards retrieved their swords the moment she signaled them, sitting back down but still glaring at Gatton. A single funny movement and they wouldn't hesitate to put their swords in his body. Elena simply said, "I don't like meaningless clinging, you won't get anything out of this." Gatton laughed, "I like you, and you will fall in love with me." This was prophesied. "So you're saying that you like me because of a prophecy?" Elena remained indifferent, not even asking where the prophecy came from. The latter half was prophesied, not the former. "I liked you when I saw you, it's that simple." "And whose prophecy was it?" "Mine." Elena sighed in despair. She was still curious about him moments ago, but now she could almost confirm that he was just another persistent rascal. But the innocence in his eyes surprised her, the reason why she didn't let her guards make a move just now. Nonetheless, she's had enough of his nonsense. Sue became excited again and interrupted, "Right, if you like Elena, you've gotta prove it. Why not buy us a drink?" Gatton took his pouch out before Elena could reject, and poured all his coins on the table. He pointed to everyone in the caravan and shouted, "Hey, boss. I'm treating. Give every man here a glass of ale." He'd poured out a lot of coin, but most of them were coppers. There were few silvers, even, forget about gold. This was not enough to buy even a glass of ale, much less the expensive grape liquor. Gatton scratched his head in embarrassment. My adventurer life just started. I haven't earned any." This resulted in roars of laughter in the restaurant. The lives of the other adventurers were dull and dangerous, and it was rare for them to get entertainment like this. The guards, on the other hand, got even more displeased. Sue seemed to grow even more interested about Gatton. "I'm prettier than Elena, and I have a better body too. Why don't you like me?" She was full of energy, and half a head taller than Elena. Her combat training gave her a body that was graceful and tempting, generally deemed more attractive to men. Gatton scratched his head and answered, "Well, I don't have a reason for liking her. I saw her and I liked her." Sue was not going to let this go. "Then talk about yourself. What do you have to deem yourself worthy for Elena?" Look, I'm royalty. Gatton fumbled through his pocket for an emblem. Even though the ingrained patterns on it had already faded, it was still recognizable as an ancient object. Social status remained important as long as humans existed in Norland, because many rights were granted solely to aristocrats. Then where is your castle? How many live there? These were factors that signified the power of an aristocrat. Gatton blushed a deep red and he said, "The inherited castle, it was sold a few generations ago. As for myself, I haven't yet been granted the rights to inherit it." His words were tactful, but they admitted that his family had long lost power and maybe even territory. He was someone without an inheritance from a family of aristocrats that likely lost their lands. What about other things? I'm just a level 3 warrior who hasn't found his path in life yet. Gatton flexed his muscular arms and his rock-like chest. Sadly, that proved nothing about his ability. The skills of a high-level warrior were not measured by mere muscles. Sue pouted petulantly, "Level 3 warriors, aren't they everywhere? I'm different from other level 3 warriors. I'm a genius, and my body can be inscribed with runes. Look here." Gatton stretched out his arms and removed his arm guards, revealing a vivid tattoo of a bull on his forearm. This wasn't a simple tattoo, instead a rune with magic power. It was a small spell formation inscribed into his body that strengthened his abilities. Runes greatly affected the power of an individual, and were extremely precious commodities for their power and rarity. Every other person could bear a rune on their bodies, but it was difficult to find one amongst hundreds who actually had one inscribed into them. It's just bull strength, nothing to be envious of. This much as being ingenious? The knowledgeable Tsu saw through the ability of Gatton's rune instantaneously. Bull strength could enhance a warrior's physical prowess, but as useful as it was a common rune. Still, Elena's gaze stayed on the tattoo on Gatton's arm, her brows knitted as she fell deep in thought. Unfazed, Gatton put on his arm guards and said, "I do not have the money to obtain a better rune. But wait till I discover treasures that someone left behind or kill a high-level monster, and I'll have the money. Look at my body, it can withstand the power of 4 different runes." That's more like it. Sue was barely satisfied. A person's gifts were measured by both his class and the number of runes they could bear. Most could bear only 1, so someone like Gatton who could take 4 was considered pretty good. It gave him better stats and abilities than ordinary people of his level. Since there were no further conflicts on this side, everyone stopped paying attention to their conversation. The voice of the wandering bard echoed through the bar once again as the steady rhythm of the drum and the strong alcohol complemented each other. Sue soon became familiar with Gatton, and they exchanged their experiences from their adventures non-stop as they downed their liquor. In fact, this was the first time she has been so far from home, but Gatton's captivating stories kept Sue fascinated. As time passed, the atmosphere in the dining room remained great. There was hustle and bustle, but incidents of people fighting or creating trouble never occurred. By the time everyone scattered at late night, it was obvious from the bartender's content smile that they have already drank much of the owner's expensive liquor. Even Sue was staggering as she walked, and Elena had to drag her back. The next morning, the travelers resumed their journey as per normal. While they were leaving the hotel, they were surprised to see that Gatton had long been awake, wearing robes, and was in the stable bathing the horses. This was a job only servants took on. "Gatton, what are you doing?" Sue called out loudly. "I didn't have enough money to pay the bill or the rent. It can't be helped, looks like I can only work to pay off my debts." Gatton's voice was bright and clear, filled with joy. Even with his status of an aristocrat, he did not feel embarrassed at all to take on a servant's job. His actions were skilled and serious, and the fur of the horses was soon sparkling clean under his hands. Sue could only vaguely remember now that she had pushed all the liquor bills to Gatton the previous night. She burst out into laughter when she remembered, leaving Gatton to enjoy his work as she left on her horse. The caravan headed out smoothly, but when she turned she saw a tall and mighty figure waving them goodbye from the stable. The caravan went northeast, leaving Viscount Anziker's territory and passing through Earl Vernon's lands before entering Earl Tudor's domain. Half a month passed without disturbance, and they hadn't once run into the bandit groups Sue was anticipating. It was instead Gatton that they'd met, twice. He followed the caravan on their journey, regaling Sue and Elena with stories of his adventures as he treated everyone to liquor. He'd end up forced into labor for 3 to 5 days every time to pay off the debts. The areas the caravan was passing through were rather safe and serene, so there was no chance for adventurers to earn money here. Sue pretended not to know the size of Gatton's wallet, drinking till she dropped and having him handle all her bills. "This is his punishment for always clinging on to you," Sue laughingly said to Elena, leaving the mage with no option but to shake her head in silence. The caravan continued on their journey, stopping at every rest stop to replenish their food and water supplies. Even so, the supplies on their carriage never increased or decreased, still the same old goods from the Evernight forest. Every few days, Gatton would surely appear. Each time the thunder-like clatter of his horse's steps rang out, and the bright peal of laughter resounded, the guards would know he was done paying off the last time's debts. At this point, they even felt like something was missing whenever Gatton appeared a night late. 2 months had passed, and Gatton treated the caravan to 6 rounds of liquor in total. Everyone knew that Gatton was working hard every day except, perhaps even including those 6 days. Even the guards who used to dislike him grew a soft heart for him, while Sue still carelessly and joyously left the considerable amount of liquor bills to him. These whole 2 months, Elena and Gatton spoke no more than 20 sentences, but the enthusiasm in his eyes was slowly becoming unbearable for her. The journey was tranquil, yet not so. That's how they made it to the lands of Earl Kyle of the Sacred Alliance. The Sacred Alliance was a tremendous force in the entirety of Norland, a coalition of big and small aristocrats alike, and unlike the traditional empires, their royalty was just the most powerful family in the coalition. This land was just around 3,000 kilometers from the legendary city of the continent, the Sacred Alliance capital Faust. The caravan steadily entered the small streets of Neuwüder, part of the territory that belonged to Earl Kyle. This was to be where they stopped for the night. But when they were about to enter Neuwüder proper, the caravan was greeted by the sight of 10 riders surrounding a mage who was dashing out of a small alley. The people who entered and exited through the alley were mostly traveling merchants, and the merchants who commonly used the alley quickly gave way for the mage and riders. The riders were quite skilled, swiveling their warhorses away from the people who couldn't avoid them while still managing to keep up the pace. The horseback mage let out an expression of surprise as he passed the caravan, his gaze locking onto Sue and Elena. The slim middle-aged man exuded a greenish-black glow, likely because poison from various experiments in the laboratory had sunk into his very skin. Although his pupils were turbid, his sinister gaze did not fail to make others shudder uncontrollably. His robes were unusually extravagant and intricate, an accessory that could harness magic runes. This was something only mages who were level 9 or above. The riders soon grew distant on the main road, but the gloomy eyes of the mage left a deep impression on those of the caravan, causing the atmosphere to grow dreary. When they arrived at the scheduled inn, Elena stopped the guards as they dismounted and prepared to enter. "Let's leave immediately." "Ah. But Gatton will be catching up with us today. Let's leave immediately," Elena repeated herself, and this time Sue didn't rebut as she silently got on her horse. Elena was someone of few words, and one repeat was all she would get. It was nearing dusk, and the closest road was 10 kilometers away. If they left Neuwüder now, they would only be able to pitch their tents in the wilderness. Sue didn't oppose Elena's decision, however, not probing further either as she signaled to the guards to get going. Everyone got back on their horses again, and the caravan resumed their journey. Once they stepped out of Neuwüder, they began to accelerate, even abandoning a few of their slower horse carriages on the streets as they went on. Even so, having traveled not even 20 kilometers, they were alarmed by the booming sound of horse steps behind them. Elena pointed to a low mound on the side road and said in a hushed voice, "Change direction, protect and defend." The guards promptly abandoned their carriages and charged up the hill on their horses. They got off immediately, drawing their weapons. Even though each of the guards had a long sword, more than half drew their bows as their main weapon. This was definitely not normal in a common mercenary troop. The thunder of multiple horses closed in on them from the end of the main road, war horses clad in armor rushing out from the smoke. The riders were heavily armed as well, each with a 2-meter-long iron sword in hand. There were about 50 riders from Earl Kyle himself here, more than half his elite troops. Flanking with the armed riders were hundreds of lightly armed troops, and at the center of it all was that mage the caravan met at dusk. He was still dressed in those extravagant robes, but now he had a 3-meter-long staff in hand as well, the tip embedded with a huge crystal. The light from the crystal converged with the patterns on the robes, making them shine mysteriously in the twilight. The guards' expressions stiffened with the appearance of the armed riders. The people of the caravan knew some martial arts, and even the coachmen were level 2 warriors, but they were all lightly armed and didn't add up to more than 50 people. Normal bows posed a limited threat to the armed riders, and on top of that their opponents even had a mage with them. With the mage no longer concealing his aura, the caravan could notice that he was a great mage who was at least level 12. Even high-ranking aristocrats like Earl Kyle had to treat such powerhouses with courtesy, so he was most likely working for someone higher up the ladder. Everyone on the mound quietened down and prepared for battle. Their only hope now was that they were not the targets of the riders and troops, but that hope seemed bleak. Sounds of horse steps rung in the streets of Neudeuter once again. Mounted on a black warhorse, Gatton rushed through the streets to stop at the front door of the largest inn in town. However, he didn't see the familiar horse carriages of the caravan nearby, and the stable was also practically empty. None of the horses he'd come to know over 2 months of working the stables were inside. Gatton's thick brows furrowed once again. The black warhorse spun around in place for a bit, its hooves sounding against the ground once more as Gatton rushed out of the streets on his horse like the wind. The horse and rider disappeared into the vast night. The mound had already become a place of bloodshed, the slope soaked in red as the corpses of horses and humans alike were stacked on one another. Even so, the sound of horseshoes clinking against the ground never ceased, the armed riders fighting fiercely at the foot of the mound as they prepared to strike once more. The caravan's defenses hadn't wavered, and 9 of them had already been lost. There were still 41 of them left, however, and their battle might remain rather frightening. Their first blow directly blasted through the defenses of the mound, ending the lives of tens of people from the caravan. However, the bows of the guards were extraordinary as well, even one arrow able to pierce through their armors and cause great damage. More than 20 of the lightly armed troops who were meant to control the opponents had been shot down, the light armor practically useless in front of the sharp arrows. Sue was panting hard, both hands on her sword as she aimed it forward. Her body was slightly bent, trying to maintain a posture that was ready to strike at all times. Her eyes were firmly fixated on the mage who was a few hundred meters away. Her two-handed sword emanated a beam of light, revealing it to be a powerful magic sword. Although she wasn't very high level, the girl had excellent swordsmanship and burst damage capabilities. Even an armed rider would be split in twain if they tried to take her attack head-on, and she was in fact the one who'd done half the damage to those riders. Fire, lightning storms, and explosions littered the battlefield. Elena was in the midst of an intense battle with the mage, possessing the sheer control to block his attacks despite only being level 6. Still, such a great difference in power could not be bridged. Elena's face had turned pale, and her forehead trickled with sweat. This caravan was truly bizarre. They weren't high level on average, inferior to Earl Kyle's troops, but their gear and skills were so much superior to their opponents that they could resist the attacks of the stronger enemies for so long. Sue was trying to save her energy, her eyes revealing her intention to launch an attack. The target wasn't just anyone, instead the great mage. Theoretically she shouldn't have been a threat to him, with the 40 armed riders in her way and the hundreds of meters of distance, but the mage still shuddered abruptly as he sensed some kind of unknown threat. He shifted his gaze immediately, spotting in between dozens of melees that the girl had drawn a well-crafted and exquisite short bow. It was tiny, like a child's toy, but just the sight of it made the biggest threat to his life. The mage smiled at Sue. His eerie smile caused her to shiver. Still, her hands remained steady, her actions skilled and precise. An intricate small arrow was nocked, and like a bolt of lightning it shot towards the mage's forehead. The path of that arrow completely defied the principles of nature, traceless as if it leaped through space before arriving at its destination. The protective shields on the mage's body slowly disappeared. This was one of the most powerful archer skills, magic break. As the arrow left the bow, Sue involuntarily let out a breath of air. But the scene before her caused her to widen her eyes, causing her body to stiffen up. The mage continued to smile strangely. The fumes from the explosion of spells seemed to gather behind him, silently drawing a large sword and having it sit in front of the mage. The arrow struck the blade and bounced off like it really was just a toy, and the smoke disappeared to reveal a heavily armored knight. Irresistible light was glowing from the joints of the knight's armor, and the warhorse he was sat on was half a fold bigger than the rest. There was no armor or harness on the horse, but complex runes were inscribed on its fur. Rune Knight! Sue cried out, and this was the first time she'd ever revealed such terror. Rune Knights were the epitome of human strength. Powerful warriors with custom enchanted armor to start off with, the true source of power lay in the runes inscribed into them and their horses. One could only be called a rune knight if they could handle at least 5 runes. On the battlefield, a single rune knight could massacre a whole army easily. They had such control over the flow of a battle that the first batch of rune knights centuries ago became the nightmare of the other races of Norland. Rune masters, those who could inscribe these runes, became the most wanted people on the entire continent, but the number of them available could be counted with one hand. It took great talent to become a rune master. Sue was baffled by the appearance of the rune knight, but before she could react, a flurry of dark green leaves wrapped up her body. The leaves throbbed with magic energy as they covered her, and no matter how hard she tried to resist the magic, she couldn't. "Elena!" She screamed, but her body slowly turned transparent and vanished. The leaves were a powerful magic tool, usable only once. Their purpose was to send the target to a designation location in dangerous situations, and their power was something Sue couldn't resist. She could only watch on as a surge of mana seeped out of Elena's body, draining her until she fell to the ground. Elena was hurting so bad her vision blurred. She couldn't even see the few remaining guards. The earlier burst of magic had affected them as well, and the opponent's armored knights were readying another charge. While they could deal with light armor, this assault would wipe them all out. As for herself, she wouldn't bother thinking of the consequences of falling into her opponent's hands, for she knew that would not happen. A jade dagger appeared in her grasp, positioned towards her heart. The blade glistened with a silver sheen, the runes inscribed within capable of taking both her life and soul. Very quickly this dagger would turn her into a pile of ash. There was one last barrier remaining around her, and a spell stored in an ornament she was wearing. Once everything was broken, she would take her life. She would never leave anything behind for these humans. The armed riders let loose a thunderous charge that blocked out all noise. But this time, Elena picked up something familiar amidst that flurry of movement. Gatton had been on the side of the battlefield, and the sturdy, imposing demeanor of the Rune Knights had caused his pupils to shrink. Subconsciously he'd wanted to leave, but the moment he caught sight of Elena's barrier breaking, his face turned pale. The whites of his irises filled with threads of blood as he roared like a maniac, charging towards the Rune Knight. "It's too late for anything now." Elena's consciousness grew weak, and she gripped the dagger and stabbed it into her heart. Thud, her wrist suddenly suffered a heavy blow, causing the dagger to fly away from her body. The dagger had already scratched clothes, almost piercing skin. Once blood was drawn, its effects would have been set in stone. A powerful arm coiled around Elena's body, carrying her up. She felt herself heave with the ups and downs, like she was floating amidst the clouds. A familiar scent calmed her nerves, relaxing her senses. Her vision darkened, and she finally fainted. The last thing she felt was a sensation on her back. That man's body burned, but it was sturdy as steel. Elena didn't know how much time passed before she opened her eyes, but the first thing she saw was a naked back with tan skin and tight muscles, littered with scars. The man didn't have to turn for her to know it was Gatton. Her head was still fuzzy, and her body had no strength. She wondered how a level 3 warrior managed to bring her out of the battlefield as she looked up. She wasn't in a castle dungeon, but in a cave. She struggled to sit up and felt a sudden coldness hit her chest that made her realize that her robes were completely ripped apart. Even the resistant innerwear had been torn, and as she sat up her clothes fell apart to reveal her chest in its entirety. Gatton heard the movements behind him in that same instant, turning around to see Elena in all her glory. "You!" Elena shouted angrily. She lifted her hands, preparing to unleash a burst of magic, but with her mana long since exhausted, the act caused her vision to black. She almost fainted again to the immense pain in her hands, her body weakening as she fell to the ground. Gatton was startled. He rushed to catch her, hugging her in support. Elena struggled violently, but then Gatton protested, "I've already seen it all, so stop struggling, will you?" His voice carried a mysterious power, and Elena slowly came to consciousness as she saw his blood-covered face, reeking of blood yet carrying a tender expression. The left of Gatton's chest was wounded right over his heart, and her struggles had caused the wounds to split open once again. Blood spurted out of it like an arrow. Seeing the color draining from Elena's face, Gatton laughed rather lightly. "The Rune Knight stabbed me, but I'll be fine. I needed to take a blow to escape from him. Hayes is too young to be that fast." Elena stopped moving, not bothering to wipe the blood on her face. Her chest was still exposed, but she didn't think about that anymore, focusing on the wound at Gatton's chest. Even with all the luck in the world, a level 3 warrior would have to face consequences if he tried to escape from a Rune Knight. The man's heart was likely penetrated, judging by the depth of the wound. Gatton seemed to understand before she continued, taking her hand and putting it on his chest. Elena felt a strong, steady heartbeat under his staunch muscles. "I have 2 hearts, and can recover faster than beasts. It doesn't mean anything to lose one." His laughter was still bright, giving Elena a sudden peace that made her feel safe. When Gatton leaned down to kiss her, she did not resist. As night fell, the bonfire in the cave chased away all the coldness. Gatton and Elena sat beside the fire. A wild rabbit was being barbecued, but Elena had little appetite as she hugged her knees and rested her head in them, blanking out. Right at the climax of their intimate session, she just shoved Gatton off. Any other guy would probably be furious, but he acted like nothing happened and instead turned happily to make dinner for the both of them. His eyes were filled with an innocent bliss and love, and she could see no signs of hatred or resent in them. "Do you like me?" "Of course." "Why?" "No reason." Elena sorted her thoughts before speaking again. "We barely know each other. You don't understand me and don't know my past. Did you even think about why we got attacked by Earl Kyle? You should know I have secrets." "Doesn't matter. I'm an Arcaran, and if we like someone we like them." "There's no rhyme nor reason to it," Gatton said casually. "At any price?" "Of course. What if I wanted you to die?" "If there was a need, then sure." Gatton smiled. Elena did not say much, growing silent. She didn't really believe the man's words. They had no great understanding of each other, in fact they hadn't even spoken much. Even Sue was more familiar with him than her, but he was willing to die for his love? Humans. They give mindless promises, but are never prepared to uphold them. And yet she saw the bright red gush of blood still flowing out of Gatton's wound, and Elena wavered. Silence reigned. It took what seemed like an eternity for Elena to speak. "Is everyone from your family so, stupid?" Gatton asked with a laugh, continuing, "Perhaps it's true. We're all silly when we're young. But it's okay to be stupid. The scariest thing is never being able to find someone to grow stupid for. Your statement is invalid. But this surname, Sharon, is a little weird. Could you tell me your name? Gatton Isaiah Satanastoria Sharon. Surprised, Elena lifted her head to gaze at Gatton. His eyes were still like the purest and most perfect of gems, but her heart was no longer at peace. The name was ridiculously long and difficult to pronounce, but she could recognize that this was a naming tradition of demons. If this man really had demon blood in him, the name alone would be able to bind him greatly. The power wasn't the same as with a demon's true name, but it was still comparable. She kept quiet for a while, finally saying, "Didn't your family tell you not to give your name out like that?" "You mean my true name?" Gatton chucked. "My mother told me the moment I matured not to tell anyone. But if I had to, it could only be one person. So, he knows everything." Suddenly, Elena could not find the words to speak. She only felt that this man, like everything related to him, was very absurd, yet so very real. Somehow, such a thing that touched one's heart existed between the realms of illusion and reality. Just like Gatton had said, his words were a sincere pact of his willingness to die for her. Telling her his true name was as good as putting his life in her hands. Truly, how could there be such a silly man? What do you want to be, then? You'll remain an adventurer? Of course not. I'll create my own army and fight the other races, pave out lands, and establish my own kingdom. Gatton said with dignity, as if he was a general who had led thousands of troops before. Elena kept quiet and only looked at the jumping fire. Her face looked dull and dark in contrast to the bright fire, bringing out the faint distress in her expression. Wind floated by from the other side of the sky, quietly cloaking the three moons as the night darkened. She stood up. "I'm leaving." Gatton was surprised. "Leaving? Where to? Where I'm supposed to be." She did not at all slow down, heading straight outside the cave. "Next time, There shall be no next time." Elena shouted as she disappeared into the night, but her voice echoed within the cave. Gatton stayed there, stunned, and did not chase after her. He'd just lost a heart, so he didn't have the strength to chase after a level 6 mage. Moreover, the girl had mysterious powers that normal mages didn't. Gatton sat down defeated, pulling at his hair. He was silent for a while before laughing hysterically. "It's all right. Our Karens go crazy anyway. Give in to the insanity or die in the silence." Which bastard was it that said that? His laughter echoed far and wide in the silent night. The bonfire remained lit, the rabbit having long since burned to ash. Time never stopped ticking, and 5 years had swiftly slipped through their fingers. The Evernight forest lost its peace in the 6th spring, as the humans brought armies that made it into the depths of the forest layer by layer. The beauty and serenity of the forest was destroyed by brute force and magic. Flames engulfed the place, and trees were burnt to the ground. Magical beasts were forced out of their habitats, because even the strongest of them were no match for the humans. The Evernight forest was traditional territory of the Silvermoon elves. Generations of elven royalty had protected this forest they called home, and they would do anything they could for their lands. The elves' biggest enemies were the humans, attacking them again and again in their greed for any materials they could get. But the invasion this time round was different from that of the past. The commander of the armies an unprecedented genius at war. He led a troop of 50 rune knights that decimated the advantages of even the most experienced archers. Conflict erupted between the tribes, putting the troops in disarray as the strongest of the lot fell one after the other. More than half of the 12 elven kings had died in battle, and even the sacrifice of a majority of the soldiers couldn't keep the invasion at bay. Weapons clashed as fires burned, violence spreading throughout the Evernight forest as the humans charged to Silvermoon Palace at its depths. With no way out, the many tribes of Silvermoon elves joined forces and launched an all-out war, but alas, the elves were wiped out. After 1,300 years of reign, the elves of the Evernight forest had fallen. A small group of elves was running away within the Evernight forest. They seemed to be one with the woods, leaving only shadows behind as they moved swiftly between the galloping horses and murderous war cries. Fires devoured the ancient trees to clear a path for their front lines, and their appalled faces spoke volumes of how this battlefield was no longer the forest they were familiar with. Groups of knights leapt forth to intercept them from time to time, but they continued to move on. The world tree burned in a raging inferno in the distance, the tongues of fire dyeing half the sky red. The elves surrounded a young shaman protectively, only leaving formation when an enemy tried to intercept. They put their lives on the line to protect the young lady, powerful elven warriors falling one by one as the onslaught of rune knights continued unabated. The female shaman hugged a thick golden book close to her. This was the Codex of Volusia, the most sacred item of the Silvermoon elves. She wasn't slower than the soldiers she ran with, and one wouldn't be able to tell she was actually a mage on first sight. Having passed through trial after trial, she was left with only 2 warriors by her side. The path in front of them opened up abruptly, and a calm lake came into sight. This was the pearl of the Evernight forest, the Crescent Lake. There was a knight sitting quietly next to the lake, blocking their way. A tense aura filled the air, disturbing the peace and serenity of the forest. If one looked in the water, they would find all the organisms had put a halt to their activities, dropping to the bottom to hide. Even though there was only one knight blocking them, his tall and lofty stature made him appear like a mighty mountain. Even the black warhorse he rode was bigger than normal, and his vestments were so thick he could probably scare off commoners. He seemed unfazed by anything, only huffing out bursts of fiery air from his nostrils every once in a while. The sword in his hands was 3 meters long, still covered in fresh blood, Silvermoon elf blood. The female shaman stopped in her tracks as the warriors by her side charged forth, attacking the horseback knight. This was a battle that could only end in death. All they wanted to do was drive their swords into the chest of the knight. They ignored the response coming their way as they charged, but a vile laughter resonated from within his helmet as a sword swept forth like lightning. The knight dismounted from his horse, visibly stained with bestial blood. He walked towards the shaman and laughed, the beautiful and elegant shaman of the moon. "You're so important amongst the elven royalty, did you really think I'd let you and the sacred book get away so easily? My reward would be halved if I did that. This is my first time commanding such a large and powerful army, I surely can't let that happen." As soon as he was done speaking, 2 lifeless elves fell onto the ground. Even the best elite guards of the Silvermoon Royals hadn't been able to dodge the knight's blade. However, the shaman only shuddered slightly, asking in exasperation, "Gaten?" The knight's body stiffened like a stone statue as he took off his helmet and revealed his chiseled face. Indeed, this was Gaten, the past 5 years having left no trace on him but maturity and resolution. The adventurer had become a general that led thousands of troops, achieving things no human had ever performed in this plane. Only, that pair of eyes was just as pure and clear as it was 5 years ago. Gaten stared at the female shaman, and his expression turned to one of great joy. He exclaimed loudly, "Elena!" Standing in front of Gaten was a beautiful shaman of the moon goddess, not the plain-looking human mage from years ago. Still, Gaten managed to recognize those eyes. The once level 3 warrior now understood the Silvermoon elf's secret transformation spell. Gaten's joy slowly faded as he grew bitter, and he said slowly, "So you were a Silvermoon elf, and the shaman of the moon on top. You were actually royalty, no wonder you were so strong with magic all those years ago, but..." His gaze remained fixed on Elena for a while, before he smiled with cheer, "Hey, beautiful. You're more beautiful than the most perfect woman in my imagination, but I still liked you better as a human mage." That familiar chuckle. It made Elena feel like she was 5 years in the past again, but the thick and cold codex in her hands awoke her from her thoughts. The shaman of Volusia had to be pure and flawless. Elena held up the Codex of Volusia, saying coldly, "Gaten, your hands are stained with too much of the Silvermoon elf's blood. Only one of us can leave here alive today." Gaten rubbed his nose gently and smiled bitterly. "You are no match for me." He could not finish his words, because Elena had already started charging towards him at the speed of an elven warrior. The codex glowed as the cover page flipped open. Gatton twirled the two greatswords in his hands as he looked at the charging elf, his incredibly fast attack able to kill even man-eating demons, much less the delicate elves. He already possessed inconceivable skill. Death was already knocking at her doorstep, but Elena did not sense it. Even as she charged towards him, the only thing going through her mind was scenes of her encounters with Gatton. "What if I wanted you to die?" she'd asked in front of that flickering bonfire. If there was a need, then sure. 5 years had passed, his looks did not change a bit. He really had become a general leading a few thousand soldiers, but why did his troops have to be pointed at the Evernight Forest? The corners of Elena's lips suddenly lifted. The sword tips were zooming closer and closer in her eyes, but she did not dodge. A short sword emerged from the codex as she sped up, aiming it brutally at Gatton's chest. She still remembered that night when she'd felt his heartbeat with her own hands, and she knew the position of his second heart. Elena knew that Gatton would not be able to dodge this strike. This was the most powerful skill of the Silvermoon Palace, the secret moonlight slash. As the shaman of the moon, her swordsmanship was actually stronger than her magic in holy spells. No armor would be able to stop this sword once blessed by Elucia herself, and not even the rune knights that were the epitome of human prowess would survive. The short and sharp blade left no mercy. Images of the deep wounds on Gatton's chest appeared in Elena's eyes. 5 years ago, he'd lost his first heart to save her life. Now, the short sword in her hand was about to pierce through his second. She did not intend to dodge Gatton's sword at all, and she could not dodge it either. She could only hope that her sword pierced Gatton's heart before his sword slashed her waist. She had to avenge the lives of the Silvermoon elves lost to the raging fire. Let us stay together in this forest, was what she thought. The moonlight sword ruthlessly slashed through Gatton's armor, piercing through his chest and penetrating deep into his throbbing heart. The raging power within the sword completely destroyed his atria and ventricles. The greatswords stopped all of a sudden. They had made contact with her skin, but the tips went no further. The hands that gripped them remained as steady as mountains. Gatton looked at Elena like he wanted to say something, but he could no longer make any sound. However, he was smiling as he fell to the ground alongside his weapons, into Elena's embrace. His blood soaked half her body, just like 5 years ago. Elena was speechless. The world before her was a blur, and hot blood rushed through her body. It's okay to be stupid, the scariest thing is never being able to find someone to grow stupid for. The words this man had once said filled Elena's head. It was right after that he'd told her his true name without hesitation. The codex dropped to the ground. Elena wrapped her arms around Gatton, and his body slowly lost its temperature in her arms. No! She hugged him closely, whispering, "You won't die." Gatton spent the next 7 days between dream and reality. When he opened his eyes after, he found himself lying in a cave. He could feel no heartbeat, but he was nonetheless alive. He turned around to find some scattered shaman robes with dry bloodstains on them. The blood reeked, but not enough to overpower the fragrance of the woman he so loved. A faint, sweet fragrance that enveloped him too. The scent lingered, but he could no longer see Elena's beautiful silhouette. The past few days of tenderness, spring and intimacy were all but an illusion, leaving no traces anywhere. This time, there really was no next time. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1 Chapter 1. Growing Up. Spring was a well-liked season. Humans could finally start the new year after the slow crawl of winter, no longer needing to bear with the freezing cold and being able to obtain food much easier. There was an increase in the variety of food as well, so spring was the most important season of the year. Be it for humans, dwarves, orcs, elves, or even ogres, supernatural creatures and carnivorous beasts, they had important events during spring. Of course, the world was really complicated, and there would always be exceptions. For example, spring was mostly meaningless to those that lived underground. In the most extreme case, snow demons absolutely hated spring. On the other hand, however, a majority of the human race found the season delightful. When the warm, moist air flowed across the mountains and the sea with difficulty to reach the village of Rusland, the villagers knew that spring had arrived. Rusland was located amidst a mountain range near the coast. It was a tiny speck amidst the enormous mountains that stretched for thousands of miles, ruled by Baron Tucker under the Sacred Alliance. It was almost 300 kilometers from the Baron's castle, so only during harvest season would the villagers see the Baron's tax collectors come over. His leadership was otherwise negligible, only felt for this short time. The Baron taxed lightly as well, only collecting the specialties of the area so that it didn't have much impact on the daily lives of the villagers. Were the tax to increase in a poor harvest year, there would be dire consequences. It wasn't all that bad living in the mountains. As long as you worked all year round, you would be able to survive. The lands outside the village needed to be plowed and seeded in spring, and the food harvested in summer. Hunters would begin to enter the forest at this time as well. The magical beasts, having just woken from their hibernation, would be exceptionally dangerous and aggressive in their search for food, but there were some specialties in their bodies like precious medicinal ingredients or glands that could be turned into perfume. Their quality would be the highest in spring, so despite the casualties and injuries every year, hunters always entered the mountains without fail. This made the goddess of the hunt the most worshipped of all the gods. Aside from the eternal dragon, there were as many gods and religions in Norland as there were stars in the sky. Norland was a continent with abundant resources, ruled by divine powers under a strict hierarchy. Even a remote and peaceful village like Rusland had quite the history, and despite being simple and sincere, the villagers respected experts and disdained the weak. The small village, with only tens of households, followed its own implicit hierarchy. The petite figure of a boy appeared outside the village, carrying a wicker basket filled with breadfruit almost as tall as he was. The winter reserves would normally be used up by spring, so before other sources of food could be obtained, even this bland fruit was still an important source. It was easy to find as well, growing in the forest beside the village. There were 3 other boys beside him, each one of them a head taller than the child. They had bows and pitchforks in hand, and daggers at their waists. Even if they were less than 10 years of age, they were all carrying deer and rabbits on their backs, able to go hunt already. Of course, they only targeted the docile animals, but it was no simple task to lay the traps to catch these animals. Be it of commoners or nobles, children of the village learned these things from their parents. The leader of the trailing group suddenly shouted out, "Hey Richard, where's your father? Hasn't he taught you how to hunt? I was already in the mountains at your age, setting traps to catch rabbits by myself." A boy beside him followed up with a giggle, "A kid without a father can only pick fruits." The 3 older boys laughed as they dashed past Richard to enter the village. Their steps were light, making it hard to believe that each was carrying over 10 kilograms of prey from the way they moved. The little boy didn't mind their mockery, however, continuing to carry the basket on his back as he entered the village. A middle-aged man sitting at the entrance saw the entire thing, calling him over and stuffing some dried magical beast meat into the boy's hand. He caressed the boy's head with affection. "Little Richard, aren't you mad about Beirut and his friends bullying you like this? I'll teach them a lesson later. Even if they're just kids, they shouldn't be so careless." He hadn't expected the child to shake his head in reply, "There's no need, I'm not angry." But the man used his large, black and calloused hand to scratch the back of his head, finding it a little hard to understand the boy. He thought the kid was scared of them, and couldn't help but want to say something. After all, kids in the mountains could lack anything but courage. However, the boy then smiled and continued to say, "Even if I don't have a father, I have the best mom." The man just continued to scratch his head, shocked into a silly smile by the statement, "That's right. That's right." The little boy hummed as he continued to carry the large basket, skipping his way into the village. His slight gloominess had given way to joy, because his mother had to stay happy no matter what. Little Richard had turned 6 this year, and he'd learned happiness. The middle-aged man was the village blacksmith, Bobby. The boy's mother was a magic acolyte named Elaine, having come alone to the village of Rusland when pregnant with her son. She wasn't exceptionally beautiful, but her personality was as gentle as water, and her presence meant the village had a doctor for the first time. They didn't need to run a dozen kilometers to the nearby town anymore, even when they were only slightly hurt or sick. Sometimes they'd even chosen to bear with the discomfort because of the distance in the past. Elaine had set up a small medicinal clinic beside the village. Even though she could only make the most basic of medicines, she'd already saved many villagers since she arrived. The village head and some elders thus decided to give her some land, officially making her a villager of Rusland. With a majority of the villagers being hunters, there were 3 main centers of authority in the village now. One was Bobby the blacksmith, and another was the village head, who was a retired military officer. The last was now Elaine, who along with the other 2 supported the future of the entire village. Life in Rusland was very peaceful and slow-moving, a year passing again in the blink of an eye. Richard was a couple centimeters taller this spring, looking like kids that were 8 to 9 years of age. Traditionally, he'd already have learned to set traps for rabbits and other small herbivores by now. There were many small magical beasts in the forest near Rusland, the large ones almost never seen. The place was a training ground for the children of the village, so the hunters didn't hunt the smaller animals. They only patrolled the area every once in a while, eradicating any dangerous creatures or the rare larger magical beasts in the depths of the forest. Still, Richard continued to carry a basket on his back up the mountain every few days. It wasn't as beat up as it used to be, but it proved he was still plucking breadfruit that was everywhere on the mountain. Breadfruit wasn't delicious, and the villagers much preferred the meat of magical beasts, which was tasty and also gave them strength. This was all at his mother's behest. He also collected medicinal grasses, collecting a different type for each of the 4 seasons and having to deal with them using certain complicated processes. Taking the grass home was only half of the job, the rest only done once he'd gotten back. What he didn't understand was that even the breadfruit needed to be processed like the grasses. In fact, it actually took more time than the grasses themselves. The other villagers didn't do this, and just ate them directly after they picked up the ripened fruits that had dropped onto the ground at night. His mother instead had him pluck the fruits from the tree, with a fixed requirement for the color and size of the fruit and even a special way to pluck it. However, when he ignored her instructions and thought there wouldn't be any difference, his mother had caught him, so he didn't play any more tricks after being berated a few times. He picked the fruits seriously, processing them to perfection. Only in winter did his mother tell him that this was all to train his perseverance. Little Richard had turned 7 this year, and he'd learned perseverance in his tasks. If he had to say what he disliked in all 7 years of his life, it was that breadfruit was his daily dinner. It was a small nightmare that he'd never forget. Rusland remained the same as ever the next spring. Bobby was still single, and Elaine still had low business. The village head was as healthy as ever, being the first to charge forth in dealing with strong magical beasts. Richard, however, had finally learned to set traps. Still, Beirut and the rest had already started using short bows and following the hunters into the mountains. Already 10, they could call themselves youths. People in the town would even think they were about 15 or 16 with their well-built bodies. Setting traps required a lot of experience. One needed watchful eyes, a pair of agile hands, and some luck. With the crude tools used in making the traps, there was a high possibility that traps made by an inexperienced hunter would injure him. Richard had talent, overcoming these problems for the village youths in the very first try. His success accrued praise from the adults of the village, and Bobby especially was jubilant since he thought of Richard as his own son. This was something everyone in the village knew. If Richard were willing to call him father, Bobby would probably agree to close his shop up. In but a few days, Richard was proficient in many types of traps. He started going deep into the forest, setting up large, complex traps. Large magical beasts appeared here on occasion, and with his luck a Kamchatka wild boar appeared in his sights, setting the trap off head-on. The beast's front legs were captured securely amidst thorns, rattan rope, and iron nails, and even though it was really strong, the trap was so meticulously made that its struggles were borne by the entirety of the trap. The boar was unable to break free even after a violent struggle. Hiding nearby as he observed the boar's struggles, Richard's hands were covered in sweat. It was the first time he felt like the hunting knife in his hands wasn't reliable. An injured boar was extremely dangerous, and even though the wild boar in front of him was really small, he himself was only a kid. Just when Richard was certain that his prey couldn't escape the trap, wanting to charge out, he felt a great force knocking him to the ground from behind him. He felt giddiness as blood filled his mouth and nose, hearing an arrow whistle and the boar shriek. He then heard cheers from his side, belonging to voices he knew. Richard slowly climbed up to his feet, seeing Beirut and his party having appeared at some unknown time. One of them had pushed him aside, and Beirut was the one who'd shot the arrow. It had landed a fatal blow on its neck, a difficult task even on a captured beast as it had been struggling constantly. "You stole my prey." Richard suddenly realized what they were doing, and shouted in rage. "Everyone here can prove that I shot the boar dead. How can you say I snatched the kill? Because of that trap of yours? A good hunter knows that this sort of trap can only be used to capture rabbits." Beirut looked at Richard with disdain. He was almost a head taller than Richard, and was well built. Being the son of the village head, he was much stronger than other kids his age, almost like an adult. The head frequently hunted powerful magical beasts from nearby, and the meat of those beasts greatly toughened the bodies of those who consumed it. "Why are you here hunting wild boar then?" Richard's counter-question made Beirut tongue-tied. They looked down on Richard's thin and frail body, but they couldn't deny that he was really intelligent. They heard that he could write a lot of words, but that was no cause for respect. What was the use of words when they couldn't help one hunt? Richard's question enraged Beirut. He made a rough downwards motion with his hand, signaling a youth at his side to move behind Richard and push him to the ground again. Richard's small face was flushed as he climbed back to his feet. He then gripped on his hunting knife tightly. His aura at that instant caused these youths to feel extremely cold, but Richard hesitated for a moment and Beirut took the chance to kick Richard down. The youths charged on him together, snatching the hunting knife away and assaulting him with kicks and punches. Beirut even stepped on Richard's head, causing his head to be deeply buried into the soil. The bodies of these mountain youths were filled with strength, and their blows were not light. However, Richard didn't struggle, resist, or plead for mercy, just quietly bearing the assault even as Beirut hit harder and harder with his growing rage. The lack of response made Beirut feel like he was being mocked. "Do you concede?" The youths began to hit harder and harder, but Richard just let them attack him like his body wasn't his own. Beirut actually grew terrified after a short while, scared that he'd injured Richard severely. He'd definitely be beaten when he got back home, and while the village head was as hot-tempered as him, Elaine had an outstanding image in the village. The youths gradually stopped their assault. Richard then took a while as he slowly climbed up to his feet, and Beirut tossed a few harsh words his way before taking the wild boar and leaving. Seeing them disappear from view, he rested at a tree for a long time before struggling to stand up and head home. When Elaine saw little Richard's body covered completely in bruises at night, tears flowed out from her eyes. The boy instead consoled her, saying he was fine and that it only hurt a little. The boy looked at his mother after medicine was applied to his wounds and asked, "I still can't fight back?" "MHM." Elaine gritted her teeth and nodded with all her might. "All right, I won't fight back. But I also won't concede." Beirut saw trouble with Richard a couple times after that day, beating him again and again. The worst time left Richard unable to get back on his feet, but he still didn't plead for mercy, or even groan. He always eventually got back up after they were tired of beating him, preparing to leave. He'd then stare at Beirut quietly, his calm demeanor causing the boy to feel an iciness in the depths of his heart. That gaze was the same gaze one leveled at a corpse. Beirut started to have nightmares that year, suffering from them for a couple of days every time he beat Richard up. The difference in their physiques was only growing, but Richard still never resisted. Beirut didn't understand why Richard never complained about him to his father, which would get him whipped a couple of times at the least. In fact, Richard hadn't spoken to anyone in the village about being beaten. The youths sought less and less trouble with Richard as time went on. One time, the boy smiled at them as blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, causing them to disperse in confusion. It was also the last time they beat him up. When Richard was 8 years old, he had learned tenacity. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1 Chapter 2. Ceremony. Little Richard lost his childishness by next spring. The hunting knife at his waist was no longer a decoration, used as he started to join the hunters in the mountains. He wouldn't venture too deep, nor was he at the front lines fighting the magical beasts, but he still helped around with tasks like setting up traps and collecting prey. Blacksmith Bobby had grown elated at this, making the child a new knife with strong, tempered steel. He grew joyous whenever Richard used it to kill a magical beast. There was always some danger associated with a hunter's life. Countless magical beasts were hidden along the coast and inside the mountains, and some occasionally got lost and headed for Rusland. Richard once met an ashen devilwolf, a genuine rank 2 magical beast that even the village head had to treat seriously. There were only 2 other hunters beside Richard at the time, and it took a bitter fight to kill it. All of them suffered heavy injuries, but they still managed to drag the wolf's corpse back to the village. Richard's abnormal calmness in dealing with the battle to the death amazed the villagers. Even the best hunter of the village wouldn't be able to do better. Moreover, if it wasn't for a clean slice from him at the back claw muscles of the devilwolf, the outcome might have been different. No matter what, little Richard had calmly faced the many dangers he'd met this year, staying collected as he dealt with the situation. He'd never cowered in the face of danger. At 9 years of age, Richard had learned courage. It should have been the easiest thing to learn, as mountain youths never lacked guts, but the courage his mother had taught him was extraordinary. With his success, Elaine stopped calling him Little Richard. "My Richard is finally a real man," she always said, brimming with smiles whenever she looked at him. One day, Richard puffed his chest out at this statement, "I still need wisdom to be a real man." This shocked his mother, who looked seriously at him and asked, "Tell mother who told you that." "It was written in a book." "Which book was it?" Elaine asked patiently. Even acolytes possessed great knowledge, and Elaine had taught her son many languages that were complex and archaic. Reading wasn't a problem for the child, and he'd even completed many books on the basics of magic during the uneventful winter. However, Elaine couldn't recall such a statement in any of them. It was that book in the attic. There were a lot of interesting things in it. I didn't know the world was so big. Richard replied in excitement. "That book?" Elaine seemed to remember something, continuing with a smile, "It really is interesting. My Richard. A real man truly can't lack in wisdom, but tenacity, perseverance, and courage are harder to master. You're so smart, you definitely won't lack wisdom when you grow up. Mother just wanted to nurture some more traits in you. Do you understand? You forgot happiness," Richard added hastily. Elaine smiled as she caressed Richard's head and replied, "That's right, and happiness. Was my Richard happy these past few years?" Richard shook his head and said gloomily, "I haven't always been happy. Beirut bullied me, and I hate breadfruit. Anyway, mother, what kind of person is father?" Elaine's expression changed instantly. Before she replied in a gentle manner, "Your father is a true man." Richard immediately followed up, "I know. He's also the worst villain, someone mother hates the most." Elaine chuckled. Her son asked her this question every year, and this was her reply every time. He'd already memorized her answer, but the smart child had frequently heard her light sobbing in the middle of the night. He felt her deep hatred for his father every time the man was mentioned. Children had really simple minds. Their mothers loved and doted on them, and they in turn loved their mothers the most. Richard would hate whoever his mother hated. Richard asked about his father regularly for two reasons. One was curiosity, as his mother told him more and more every year. On the other hand, he wanted to have a greater understanding of his father so he could avenge his mother once he grew up. As for how, he was naturally clueless, but this matter had already been ingrained into his heart. However, Elaine stopped telling Richard about his father after this, just saying that she'd only spent a little time with him, so she only knew that much. "You'll really understand your father one day." It was unknown why Elaine's face changed after she tossed out this statement. It was as though something had seized her heart, even she herself didn't know why she had uttered such words. Richard sensed his mother's mood had turned bad, so he secretly stuck his tongue out and said, "I'll go read something." He then ran to the back of the house, to Elaine's study room cum laboratory where she brewed her potions. There weren't many books here, all about the basics of magic, medicine, the history of the continent, the scenery, and the like that were related to her identity as an acolyte, but Richard loved to read books here at night. There was a dim magic lamp in the study room, able to shine the entire night once Elaine filled it up with magic. With oil as expensive as it was, only Elaine, the village head, Bobby, and some of the best hunters of the village could have light long into the night. Richard slowly passed his childhood in this rundown but warm little room. He could see a larger, more complicated world from these thick books, distant from Rusland yet fascinating. He'd always dreamt of leaving once he'd become the most outstanding hunter of the village, bringing his mother to the world outside the mountains. In the living room, Elaine heard the sound of pages rustling from the study. Richard was hard at work reading again. The child already had a stable foundation to practice magic, but he'd never really done so. She'd forbidden him from even meditating, making him miss the optimal age of 4 or 5 to become a good magician, which would have given him the accumulated mental strength to start practicing at his current age. Despite this, Richard didn't think in the slightest that her arrangement was bad, being ignorant and just assuming whatever his mother did was correct. She sat there quietly, thinking of that one extra sentence she'd spoken. A door opened up in her sealed memories, flooding forth with several events that she couldn't suppress. She felt a mild headache coming on, gently massaging her temples as she sighed discreetly. Her gaze landed on the calendar, noticing a cross on it indicating Richard's 10th birthday would be in a couple more days. 10 years of age was the threshold for a boy to be considered a youth, only 3 or 4 years away from adulthood. A decade's already passed? She stared at the flickering flames in the magic lantern, a bright light from the brass lamp illuminating her face. She couldn't be called pretty, but she still looked decent, making her one of the top beauties in the village. 10 years hadn't placed a single mark on Elaine's face, and if it wasn't for her dressing her age, probably none of the villagers would remember. Strangers would think she was still only in her 20s. Her face in the lamp was an unfamiliar sight even to her. It was too plain, not the same face she'd been born with. Even she wouldn't have imagined a decade ago that she'd be living such a simple, plain, and difficult life a decade ago, but right now she was just satisfied with watching Richard grow up day after day. When she entered the study, Elaine saw Richard hugging and reading a thick picture book with great interest. She smiled. "My Richard is going to be 10 years old soon. Mother will prepare a special ceremony to celebrate your growth." Yay! Richard leapt to his feet. Will there be presents? These kinds of moments made it clear that he was still a boy. Of course. In fact, it'll follow you for life. But you need to rest well these next few days, understand? It's late already, you should head to bed. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 3. Enlightenment. Richard nodded and headed back to his room. But judging from his look of excitement, he probably wouldn't be getting any sleep that night. Elaine shook her head endearingly, and headed up to the attic with her magic lantern. The attic was a storage for their junk, but it was well maintained with not a speck of dust in sight. Elaine shifted a box to reveal a tiny altar of stone, a meticulous spell formation carved at its base. The only thing amiss was that the idol was missing. Elaine took her time cleaning the altar, even getting at the difficult corners before she let her gaze fall on the thick book lying beside the box. It looked extraordinary at first sight, with at least 1,000 pages. It was at least 4 times as large as a normal magic tome, weighing no less than 12 kilograms. Its bronze surface shone brightly, not tainted in the least by dust or dirt of any sort, an obvious indication that it had been read often. This surprised Elaine. She hadn't been in contact with the book longer than she could remember, so Richard was obviously the one reading it. She hadn't expected the child to be reading it so actively. She walked towards it and flipped it open. Her face didn't match up to her delicate and beautiful fingers, being a cause for numerous discussions amongst the men of the village. The cover of the book was made of real bronze, weighty and cold as it radiated a sullenness of time. Within the book were hundreds of crystal beads that would create a small altar when activated, allowing one to listen to the voice of the moon goddess, Alucia. A poem in the ancient elven language decorated the title page, praising the moon goddess in all her glory. Elaine still vividly remembered every note of the poem, every intonation. She flipped through the book mindlessly, the pages slipping through her fingers smooth as water. They were mostly filled in the elven language with lifelike drawings, different from the catechisms of the humans in that the doctrines of the goddess only occupied a small part of the book. Instead, the book detailed the events and experiences of Alucia's time, including events outside Norland or even the plain. Richard was probably amused by it because he read it like it was a geography or history book. It was hard to see anything special about the book outside of its weight, but this was once the most treasured gem of the Silvermoon Palace, the Codex of Alucia. It recorded the 7 divine spells unique to the goddess and those she deemed worthy, and Elaine had been able to use 5 in the past. She was the one with the greatest comprehension of spells outside of the great druid, possessing power and the acknowledgement of the goddess herself. Now, though, she could barely cast 1 spell, and even that required her everything as well as the support of the tome. The 7 spells loomed about in the depths of her mind: Alucia's destiny, enlightenment, Alucia's blessing, healing, Alucia's wrath, punishment, Alucia's sword, Silvermoon armor, Alucia's will, trial. There were 2 other spells that Elaine remained unable to cast. One was Alucia's mind, prophecy, while the last, Alucia's days, dark moon, was something nobody had managed to use to date. Elaine placed her hand on the book, bathing in the remnants of its divine aura. The bleak moonlight of the 5th moon shone down on her through the rooftop window, the divinity of the moonlight entering her body stealthily as she built up power for the ceremony the coming week. That would be Richard's present for his 10th birthday, the divine spell enlightenment. Richard was woken up in the middle of the night on his birthday, brought to the attic and made to kneel in front of the altar. The book had been flipped open already, prayers upon it that he had never seen before. This was the ancient language of the elves, an extremely difficult and enigmatic language, but one he already spoke like a native. The prayers praised the moon goddess, but as he recited them in his heart, Richard felt like his body had oddly turned transparent. It was as if something or someone without a name had made a discovery, charging towards him to enter his body. He felt an icy sensation in his abdomen, spreading out to his limbs and the rest of his body as well. It was a fleeting but distinct feeling, a common phenomenon during worship or ceremony. Richard knew many ceremonies even required the target to endure excruciating pain, so he kept quiet and followed his mother's instructions to clear his mind of all distractions. "My Richard, you will be entering Goddess Alucia's halls in but a moment, there to receive enlightenment with regards to your destiny. If you're presented with some choices there, you may choose." Elaine stopped abruptly and shook her head. "My dear, choose whatever you want, just be sure to listen closely to the voice of the goddess and follow your heart." Richard nodded despite his confusion. He felt his consciousness slowly blurring with his mother's soft prayers, as if he was disengaging from the world. When he woke up again, he found himself in front of a magnificent shrine. From his position in this arena, the shrine that was thousands of meters around made him feel as insignificant as an ant. The surroundings were made mostly of silvery gray stone that glowed faintly, and when he scanned his surroundings he was shocked to see stars upon stars in the sky, seemingly so close that he thought he'd be able to pick some if he just stretched his hand. Both the arena and the shrine itself were floating in the starry sky. The huge area put immense stress on him, causing his heart to beat uncontrollably as he didn't dare look around even once more. He made a beeline for the shrine, crossing the entire arena and scaling thousands of stone steps to arrive at the entrance. Were it not for his stamina and endurance that he'd trained just like any other child in the mountains, he'd long since have collapsed. He didn't stop for a moment since he started running, feeling like the arena filled his horizon and his surroundings moved in tandem with him. It was like the entire area would crumble the moment he stopped, falling into an endless abyss. By the time Richard arrived at the shrine's entrance, his breaths had grown ragged. His heart was threatening to jump out of his chest, and it took a while for him to calm down before reminding himself of Elaine's words as he raised his head and looked into the shrine. The shrine wasn't a dome, instead surrounded by a circle of pristine, jade-like white stone pillars. At the middle was an altar with 3 goddesses atop it, all in different postures and positions. There were supposed to be 6 statues on the altar, each representing different abilities. The more Richard could see, the more abilities he would be able to evoke with his enlightenment. With his extraordinary memory, Richard could make out the 3 he had now. Extraordinary divinity, bestowing epic strength. Currents of life, giving him the power to heal. Wind swiftness, increasing his speed and agility. This rendered Richard slightly disappointed. He'd already wished for the blessing of wisdom in his heart, believing real men needed to be intellectuals. Still, it was good enough that he had these 3 choices, since his mother had wanted him to have more than one. Elaine hadn't told the clueless boy that more than half of those who went through this ceremony only saw an empty shrine. The boy walked towards the altar, trying his best with wide eyes to find the blessing of wisdom, but this shrine and everything that accompanied it wasn't real. What would be the result of his efforts? The only effect was that the 3 statues he could see were starting to blur in his hesitation. "You want more abilities, don't you?" A voice suddenly sounded in Richard's ears. It caused him to jump and look around frantically, but he saw nothing. The voice had come abruptly, its cold robotic tone evoking a chilling fear within the boy. Who are you?" He plucked up his courage, shouting in a trembling voice. His words resonated within the shrine, the strong echo shocking him once more. "It doesn't matter, I won't appear again. Strictly speaking, I'm your other half, hidden within you," the voice answered. "Impossible." Richard denied with resolution. His mother once told him his soul was extremely pure, and there was nothing that would taint him. His fear dissipated in a couple of words, the initial confusion and surprise fading as the courage of a mountain youth set in. The voice ignored his comment, continuing, "Now go, choose whatever you want." The altar before Richard lit up once more, revealing 3 more statues. Apart from the blessing of wisdom were elemental compatibility and nature's advocate. The former was pivotal in a magician's training, allowing them to communicate with the elements outside their body and reducing the exhaustion of their powers. It let them cast a couple more spells than other magicians of a similar grade, strengthening one's advancement. The latter allowed humans to know more about nature, increasing their stealth and speed in complicated terrain as well as strengthening nature spells. It also gave 1 poison immunity. Enlightenment had given Richard all 6 abilities. This is Richard was rendered speechless, his little head in a mess of confusion. The only logical explanation for everything was that everything was an illusion. How else could everything be so different from what his mother in the book said? Still, despite everything, the boy didn't forget his own purpose. He walked towards the statue of wisdom, reaching forward to touch the feet of the goddess. This was the significance of the ceremony, having the worshipper bow before their goddess with humility. The moment Richard's hand touched the statue, a sharp crack resonated within his mind. It was like the entire world became lucid and clear to him, giving new meaning to the words he'd read in the Holy Book. Wisdom allows people to see the world more clearly. All the other statues disappeared the moment he touched the statue of wisdom. The ceremony should have ended here by right, but the shrine didn't disappear yet. Richard glanced around nervously, seeing a new statue emerge on the altar. The statue had its arms crossed in front of its chest, the head tilted to the side looking sullen but focused. What made her different from the other statues was that she didn't seem tangible, instead made up of shadow. Could this be another ability? Richard tried his best to recall, but couldn't think of what this statue represented. Even the Holy Book had no records of this statue, but he could still recognize it as one belonging to Alucia. "Don't you want another ability?" The voice sounded again. "What is it?" Richard paused, announcing, "I don't want to give up wisdom. You can call it truth. It allows you to look at the world from another perspective, and at the end of the path you might see other things." "Other things? What are they?" he asked out of curiosity. Silence was his only answer. Richard wanted to leave. He knew that he could leave this place and go back to the real world at any time, leaving this world made from the power of the Enlightenment ceremony. The shrine had fulfilled its purpose to allow someone with talent to grow clear about their abilities and carve their future paths. On the other hand, this place wasn't completely virtual. The floating shrine was filled with the divine power of the goddess, and all 6 abilities were blessings granted by the goddess herself. The voice in the unknown 7th statue overthrew everything Richard knew, making him feel a devilish temptation. But how could the power of a devil appear in the moon goddess ceremony? He truly hesitated as he looked at the 7th statue. 2 voices fought in his head for dominance, but to no avail. Take it, or no. Despite his internal struggle, Richard's body was honest as it walked towards the statue. The world is balanced, everything comes at a price. Balance was one of the core teachings of Alucia's doctrine, so what would he have to pay for the second ability? This was the first time Richard had ever fallen into a confused struggle, but he ended up sticking his hand out anyway. His mother had told him to choose as he pleased, and he didn't want to give up on the opportunity despite the price. Little Richard was a brave boy, willing to fight for unexpected yields. He was also smart, knowing that his mother truly hoped for him to be a hero, a really great and important person. A greater person than Baron Tucker. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 4. Truth. As Richard's little hand touched the 7th statue, it scattered into shadows that bore into his body. For a moment he felt like he was on fire, his whole body burning with soul-rending pain that kept him awake but drove him insane. An icy sensation shot forth from his body to collide with the flames, making him feel like he was about to be torn apart. He ground his teeth, exercising his tenacity and resolution to persist till the entirety of the shadow entered his body. Only after the last bit of it was absorbed did he relax, the shrine in front of him starting to fade. His vision blurred, he saw the beautiful worried face of his mother just before he lost consciousness. "I got 2 abilities, Mother will be so proud of me," he exclaimed within the darkness. A large crack appeared on the altar in the attic, the very fact that such a rare altar could be damaged being appalling. Elaine didn't look good at all, blood dripping from the corners of her lips, but she could care less as she searched Richard's body, only calming down when she saw no harm was done to him. However, she then saw a shadow looming between her son's brows, something neither the lamp nor the moonlight could cast from their position. It was like a fog that moved across his forehead, not in a hurry to leave. Ordinary eyes would not be able to see it, but under the power of the 5th moon Elaine trembled as she reached out for it. She felt a cold twinge of pain upon contact, the result of a collision between dark energy and Alucia's divinity. "Nightmare creature?" Elaine screamed. She clenched her teeth and jabbed her fingers right into Richard's temple, starting to chant the spell for prophecy from distant memories. It was a spell that she'd never been able to grasp, but right now it was her best shot at freeing Richard from the menacing creature. Ever since she lost her position as a divine official, Elaine had foregone all her blessings and the spells of her goddess. Still, her desperate actions proved fruitful as a picture scroll flashed before her eyes. It showed a never-ending void of darkness, with no moon, no stars, only a chaotic energy pervading the universe. A large shadow loomed within the chaos, the originally messy trajectories of the energy ultimately being aimed at one position, her sun. The scroll flashed across her sight, the brief vision exhausting all her energy until she couldn't even lift a finger if she tried. Still, even if she was full of vigor, the image wouldn't have left her in a different position. Nightmare creatures were different from the darkness, their energy not a part of nature. Many species have wandered aimlessly between the planes, feeding on the chaos of different worlds. They were cunning, dangerous, and powerful, making them loved and hated alike by various mages. Shadow summoning was an ancient, mature art ranging from level 6 to level 9 spells that could grant control of a nightmare creature to the caster. The chance of failure was minute, but once out of control, a shadow creature would devour its summoner like it was the most delicious food they'd ever seen. Every year there was news in the mainland about accidents where mages were devoured by shades. The nightmare creature looming between Richard's brows seemed to have some indication of life, but it wasn't complete. The dark energy it possessed wasn't significant, able to be cleansed by a common shaman, but Elaine saw in her prophecy that it was a beacon for various dark beings, summoning them to this particular plane. Even if the shadow was cleansed, it would be too late. The various dark beings had already set out, and Richard would be the anchor they used to infiltrate this plane. Once a large number of creatures attacked this plane, Richard would only be met with two outcomes. He would either be killed in the violent collision of energy, or become possessed by the strongest of them and lose control of his body forever, becoming a vessel for the creatures of the dark. Nobody could comprehend the laws of the planes. These creatures could take a few centuries to arrive, or they could come here next month. How did this happen? Elaine mumbled as she closed her arms around Richard, her tears wetting both herself and her son. She lifted her head and looked at the crescent moon in the sky, and the mark like a dried bloodstain that hadn't been there before. So the change in the moon had resulted in the change in the ceremony. This probably would not have happened if she was still a shaman of Alesia. Is this her punishment? Elaine thought bitterly, having lost all strength to complain about destiny or wallow in self-pity. She carried her son downstairs, tucking him carefully into bed. His brows were slightly furrowed, but his constant smiles made it seem like he was having good dreams. Richard was a pretty boy. He'd already begun to lose his childlike features, looking more handsome and dashing by the day. Elaine looked at her own son endearingly, the center of her life for the past 10 years. A decade was but a moment in her long life, but now it had seemed like forever. Richard had grown up rather slowly, looking more childlike than others of his age, but this was to be expected with his silver moon elf blood giving him 500 years of life. However, the reason for the brusqueness being added to his exquisite appearance was something only Elaine herself knew. The shadow continued looming over Richard's face, causing Elaine to sigh softly as she left a goodnight kiss on her son's forehead before leaving the room. She sat alone in the living room and stared at the night sky, events of the past playing in her mind like they'd just occurred yesterday. Those nights were the essence of all the passion, hatred, and love in her entire life, and she couldn't help but think of them once more. The fifth moon had just given way to the sixth. When the seventh peaked on the horizon, it would be a new day. The radiance of the seventh moon spilled through the window. Elaine looked more worn than ever, but also more attractive than before. The mirror on the wall now reflected a beautiful figure, Elaine's original appearance that she'd almost forgotten over these 10 years. It was a beauty only silver moon elves possessed. She stood up, taking out a piece of magical parchment decorated with stars and spreading it on the table. She then took out a well-sealed magic pen made from a griffin feather, checking the unique unicorn blood ink to see whether it was still working. There was little ink left, but she wasn't writing a long letter either, so it would suffice. The light feather quill felt oh so heavy in her arms, and she couldn't bring herself to write anything for a long while. It took the first ray of sunlight shining through the window for her to laugh and mumble, "Someone who destroyed the Silvermoon Palace will be able to defeat dark beings, won't he? What's more, it's been 10 years. She finally convinced herself to draft a meticulous spell formation on the paper before penning down a long name. Gaten Isaiah Satanastoria Archaron. The magic pen shook the moment she finished writing the name, its tip shining with red light like the burning flames of a fire. All that was left when the fire extinguished was a faint, almost invisible mark. Nonetheless, the mark could only be eliminated only if the precious paper was destroyed. As an ex-shaman, she was aware of the secret of bloodlines. The burning flames signified that this name written down with demonic power had already triggered the power of law, being felt by the owner of the name. Everything she wrote down next would be delivered to the person in question, across the boundaries of space and time. The pen stopped again, the hand that held it trembling. This had proven another thing: Gaten really had given her his real name. Though she hadn't once suspected him, it had been proven true for the first time. With the advantage of knowing his real name, she could cast the most malicious curse on him with just a little demonic power. Even as a legendary being, he wouldn't be able to escape the damage, true names being the most significant secrets of certain bloodlines. That idiot actually revealed his real name, she couldn't help but think. But these thoughts were easily replaced by memories of the large and decadent forest. Her hands grew cold, but they no longer shivered. She jotted down her thoughts with short yet precise words, only hesitating again when it came time for her to sign off. She hesitated, but proceeded to pen her name down with exquisite and elegant writing. Elena Moonsong. The paper burned intensely and turned to ashes within the blink of an eye. The information within was being delivered. Elena put down her worries and troubles with that pen, looking quiet and beautiful. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 5. Parting. Little Richard slept for 7 days straight, only opening his eyes when the sun shone into his room on the 7th. The first thing he did when he woke up was to run out of his room and look for his mother. Finding her in the study, he threw himself at her immediately, exclaiming, "Mother! Guess what I got from the moon goddess shrine, ... Elena turned around and caressed his head gently. "Let me guess. My Richard always wanted to be a mage. Did you get the blessing of elemental compatibility?" However, the woman who'd turned around to face Richard was someone he'd never met before. He was dazed for a bit, but he still had his own way of recognizing people. He sniffed around for a bit, smelling a familiar scent. "Are you my mother?" "My dear Richard, this is Mother's real form." "Am I pretty?" Elena cooed with a smile. Richard nodded his head. "Mother is the prettiest." Elena, or rather Elaine, had always been the prettiest, most beautiful woman in Richard's little heart. But now that his mother had revealed her true form, the beauty of the Silvermoon elves that was on par with their magic had revealed itself. Children were an impatient lot, and Richard didn't have the restraint to let his mother continue guessing. "I got wisdom and truth." "Truth?" Elena was shocked. She knew about the blessing of wisdom, but she'd never heard of a blessing of truth before. Richard furrowed his brows, trying to explain with his newfound wisdom. "Truth is. The blessing of truth is something that lets me see the powers of the world more clearly. It isn't very useful right now, but it can be enhanced in the future and let me look farther, listening more clearly." Elena hummed in response, her hand on Richard's shoulder as she told him to cherish his newfound abilities. She also spent an entire hour, at least in Richard's view, nagging at him not to forget her teachings either. He made a funny face in response to his mother's unending speech. He was a smart boy with an excellent memory in the first place, and with his blessing of wisdom he wouldn't need to listen to the same thing twice. Elena finally stopped once she realized she'd been going on too long. "My Richard, do you want to see Father?" Richard furrowed his brows again, thinking hard for an answer that wouldn't come. Elena ended up interrupting him before he came to a decision. You'll be able to see him very soon. He sent some people to pick you up, they're on their way now. Now, you better remember to be on your best behavior, alright? Ha! This was coming all too fast, and Richard didn't even have the time to formulate a proper response. He suddenly realized, what about you? Won't you be coming as well? No, Mommy is not going. Then I won't go either, the child said with resolution. Elena smiled in response. No, you have to go. Mother has a wish you need to help fulfill. Don't worry about that, Mother. I'm already all grown up. Tell me what you want, I'll get it done by hook or by crook, Richard said with confidence. Elena's warm tone completely contrasted the intense gaze she leveled on her son. When the day comes that you've grown to become a real man, I want you to bury me in the highest layer of your father's family tombs. The boy nodded his head, albeit a little too enthusiastically. He was still too young to understand what this wish really was, but a mountain youth wouldn't never back down. Mornings in Rusland were normally calm and quiet, but the serenity of the village was broken by light tremors today. The vibrations increased in scale, eventually shaking even the slowest of the village elders out of their slumber. The villagers peeked out of their houses, looking at the end of the road, feeling cold. The mountain winds were cold, causing even the bravest of warriors to shiver and tremble. However, the chill they felt today was a different kind, one of the heart that foreboded of something bad to come. The villagers all gathered at the village entrance as the tremors continued, shaking the mountain to its core. They could see smoke rising in the distance, the trees swaying in a menacing manner as the birds fled their nests, flying straight for the mountains. A demonic knight suddenly rushed out of the forest on horseback. His black armor was covered in spikes, with a skull on his breastplate. Even his horse was nothing like what they'd seen before, at least half a meter taller than average. It too was adorned with thick, spiky armor, indicating that the spikes weren't just for defense. Beside the horse were two huge swords, looking like they each weighed over 100 kilograms. Such power wasn't something you stood up against. The battle horse destroyed the gravel path in its wake, sending stones and mud flying all around that left dents everywhere. 20 more followed the first knight, and behind them was an army of warriors, all equipped with shiny magical bows and sophisticated armor. An army like that could easily wipe out Baron Tucker's castle, but here they were invading their small village. The villagers paled. The hunters may be brave, but they knew they didn't stand a chance against these knights. Even the village chief picked up on some signs from the unusually tall horse. His military experience and instincts told him that these knights were very strong. The knight brought his steed to a halt, its hooves creating yet another dent in the humble path as a gust of fire swept out of its nostrils. The knight scanned across the villagers, expressionless. Do any of you know where Elena stays? The villagers looked at each other, puzzled. There wasn't a woman named Elena in the village. The blacksmith and village chief seemed to recall something, but they chose to stay mum as well. The knight turned gloomier by the second. However, Elena emerged from her medicine shop before he could speak. Did Gatton send you here? The knight's expression changed almost the very moment he looked at Elena. He swiftly got off his battle horse, landing in front of the elf. His helmet was removed as he bowed his head in respect. I am Mordred, a knight of the Lord. I'm here under his orders, to bring you back. Mordred had spiky maroon hair, and even with his head bowed down his aura was no joke. Everyone near the medicine shop trembled in his presence. Elena's own dress waved slightly, but she didn't back away. It felt like she was standing atop a gust of wind as she spoke. That makes me feel much safer. Mordred laughed heartily. Thank you for your compliment, my lady. Elena grabbed Richard from behind her, putting his small hand in Mordred's. This is the one Gatton wants. His name is Richard. Richard R. Sharon. Mordred looked at the child carefully, before taking Richard's hands in his. I am at your service. The knight looked up to Elena. I believe you've already packed, my lady. Let us set off immediately. Lord Gatton must be very anxious to see the two of you. There's something important I have to take, please wait here. Elena walked back into the shop, closing the doors. It left Richard alone with the big and mighty Mordred. The child stared right at the knight, and the knight returned the favor. After a while, Mordred burst into laughter for no apparent reason. However, his smile then froze upon his face. A sudden burst of flames emerged from the medicine shop, blasting its roof almost 10 meters into the sky. Even a powerful knight like him hadn't noticed when the explosion occurred. The knight let out a shout, charging into the medicine shop. The walls were like cheese to him, even the raging flames unable to do the slightest bit of harm. Inside he was greeted by the sight of an elegant Elena. He wanted to save her, but was shocked to see that the flames were coming out of her body. Elena had set herself on fire. She smiled once when she saw Mordred, and then she burnt and disappeared, leaving no traces behind. Mordred stood up straight, his body still engulfed in flames as that smile was etched into his memories. So beautiful, so elegant. And yet, so complicated. Richard was hysterical, kicking at the other knights that were stopping him from entering the shop, but his efforts proved futile. The place crumbled down right in front of him, Mordred walking out of its ashes to see a devastated child crying like his life depended on it. He remained silent for a short while, before saying, "You had a great mother. Let's go, I'll bring you to your father." The abrupt event stupefied the villagers of Rusland, as they watched the flames die down in a daze. They didn't want to believe that the medicine shop that had been there for them these past 10 years had been ruined in the blink of an eye. Mordred stayed behind with the army as the remaining knights got back in formation and escorted Richard out. He didn't intend to have Elena buried, she'd been lost entirely to the flames. Only a crazy genius would be able to burn themselves completely, and it gave Mordred a newfound respect for this woman he'd only met once. The corners of his mouth curved into a smile as he looked at the ruins, mumbling to himself, "This woman truly is worthy of my lord." A knight approached Mordred from the side. "What should we do with the villagers here, Sir Mordred?" He glanced at the folks that gathered round the commotion, caressed his prickly stubble and saying with indifference, "This village has too many grown men, the Lord will not be pleased. Kill everyone. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 6. Family. Gazing at the distance, Richard realized that his father was a great man. He was looking at the distant Azan Peninsula, and its city with a population of over 100,000. The city was built along the shape of the coast, looking like an arc extending to the archipelagos of the Apennine Seas while being steep in the northwest. The long, narrow piece of land was like a beast in slumber lying between the heavens and the seas. The houses and streets of Azan were organized systematically, with a 20-meter-tall wall surrounding it to protect its residents. Vast lands and inexhaustible water lay on the outskirts of town, the Rhine River cutting through its center to empty out into the seas as it provided unending irrigation for the fertile land. The renowned Blackrose Castle upon a hill within the city, a complex and majestic building that could house more than 3,000 warriors. Trebuchets were built atop the various towers of the castle, looking over the city with disdain. None of them had ever been put to use since their construction, no enemy had ever breached the city walls. The castle city was the best of deterrents, designed more than carefully with a fortified core and complex mechanisms protecting it. The wooden battlements at the top could be extended and retracted, and the tunnel-like entrance to the city had at least 5 layers of sluice gates at least 10 meters deep. There were many other traps as well, not visible to the naked eye. Indeed, it was claimed that only 1,000 warriors could protect Blackrose Castle once it had been completed, the castle being impenetrable as long as they had sufficient supplies. Many travelers of various identities visited this city, each with their own motives, but they all had to agree that the architect of Blackrose Castle was a genius. An unnamed general from a noble family was once invited to perform a thorough analysis of the castle, and he concluded that even with a well-equipped army of 50,000 alongside siege, one would have to pay a disastrous price to take the castle. However, the castle had never been put to the test. Its previous lords had never been keen on defense, and even if they had the weaker army, they'd rather use the vast plains of steep mountains to kill their enemies using guerrilla warfare. What's more, they'd always won. The lunacy of the Arcarans was well known within the Sacred Alliance. Nobody would fight these lunatics, especially with the family having geniuses within its ranks at all times. Duke Joseph of the Rhenan Peninsula, once the biggest enemy of the Arcarans, once said the combination of lunacy and genius multiplied the family's power. A 20,000-man troop of his had been defeated by the Arcaran elites in a long, violent battle, less than a tenth surviving the battle. And this wasn't with any random soldiers. Joseph's troops were amongst the best on the entire continent. The Acheron family tree had 2 marquises and 7 earls to its name and its several hundreds of years of development, alongside numerous viscounts and barons. The family also held more than 25 million acres of land. Despite their rather short history, their strength and influence in the Sacred Alliance not to be belittled. It was bizarre how many of their ranks occupied noble positions despite them not having a duke, forget a grand duke, to their name. They had great armies, powerful mages, strong warriors, and countless subordinates of strange occupations like dragon warlocks, hell riders, and shadow shamans. This was in a continent that was never at peace. Indeed, Norland was always enveloped by the fires of war. The human race occupied less than half of the continent, and was constantly at war with the other races for land and survival itself. However, humans didn't war like the demons. The latter did fight against the other races, yes, but they also fought ceaselessly amongst themselves. The never-ending battles on the continent affected the depths of the oceans, and even many other planes. With such chaos in the lands, it honestly wouldn't have been difficult for the Arcarans to have a duke or grand duke of their own in a couple of generations. They just had to use their resources wisely, establishing a complete government with law and economy and distributing their profits amongst their ranks. At least half of the current dukes of the Alliance came about through these methods, something that made the royalty of the other kingdoms act like the Sacred Alliance was a bunch of parvenus and country bumpkins, the royal family being the worst of them all. However, the Sacred Alliance's royal family had inconceivable might, so it had still garnered the respect of the old, esteemed families. The rise of the Arcarans was inferior to none, but their short history left them without as much wealth and power as the other families. Another problem was that they were simply too crazy to garner any respect. The current leader of the Arcarans, Marquis Gatton, was a prime example. He was a mere grade 3 warrior 15 years ago, but he improved quickly with time. Just a decade had passed since he defeated the Silver Moon Palace of the Evernight Forest, shocking the entire Sacred Alliance. Many had stepped foot in the forest before him, but none were daring or skilled enough to succeed at the task with 50 rune knights and 1,000 men. Gatton was already a marquis at 33 years of age, having moved into Blackrose Castle and taken control of Azen, which was the territory of the Arcaran leader. His experiences were described like legends as they spread mouth to mouth, and they were still being written down in books. The truth was, however, that his influence only extended to Blackrose Castle and the lands he'd usurped. The other members of his family almost always turned a blind eye to his commands, and he was merely a titular leader who'd have been disregarded completely if not for Blackrose Castle. Some historians who'd studied the Arcaran family tree had concluded that there was one reason for the Arcarans not having a Grand Duke in their ranks: there was a rebellious streak in their bloodline. No Arcaran would be subordinate to another, even if the other was their own father. The study wasn't detailed, nor were the historians extremely knowledgeable or reputable. The cold, hard truth was that they wished for sponsorship from the Arcarans, or they'd end up on the streets. Those with capacity wouldn't have delved into research on an uncharted family to begin with, and these people would ultimately die as plagued beggars on the streets. Rumor had it that the leader of the family had flipped through their research for only a few seconds once it was sent to him, ordering all its members to stop supporting the historians. It was the first time the rebellious Arcarans had followed through with an order. There was only one reason for this. Even if the report was filled with utter nonsense, with illogical statements and baseless accusations, their conclusion was the absolute truth. Rusland village was a mere 3,000 miles from Azen, a journey less than half a month. Mordred had filled Richard in on his family history during the trip, along with some information about the customs and the distribution of power on the mainland. By the time they'd arrived in Azen, Richard knew a little more about his family. Family. It was a fairly new term to the boy who couldn't even grasp the concept of a father in the past. However, it was very important to the mighty knight, and held a broader meaning than most. It wasn't just the direct and distant bloodline relatives, also including the various noblemen and knights under the various members. The bloodline linked every member of the clan, but it also transcended that. Different bloodlines possessed different abilities, and their combinations would often result in new powers. Some were stronger than others, and many died to chase after them. Thus, royal marriage held a completely different meaning in Norland. It wasn't just political, also intended to produce stronger, more powerful descendants. As Richard stood before the entrance of the castle, he should already have had a deep understanding of his roots, the Arcarans. However, he found himself more confused than ever, the information Mordred had given him like tiny puzzle pieces that he could not put together. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 7. An Irresistible Woman. The army dispersed upon returning to Azen, returning to their homes to rest. Mordred entered Blackrose Castle with Richard in tow, settling him down in a guest room on the outskirts of the castle. Two young maids soon brought him brand new clothes and accessories, even filling the wooden bathtub with hot water. Marquis Gatton would see him at dinner, and by then the boy would have to bathe, change, and rest. Richard was done with the bath quickly, leaving himself an hour to rest in bed after he was changed. Although he was still tired from the long, arduous journey, he couldn't calm his excited brain in the slightest. The two maids had bathed him personally, and he didn't even lift a finger before the process was complete. He tried to refuse, even struggled, but they'd easily repressed him with strength greater than that of the village chief. They appeared delicate, but he hadn't been able to resist them at all, ending up obediently letting them clean him from head to toe. Even the roots of his hair and the crevices of his ears were scrubbed squeaky clean. The guest room Richard was in wasn't very expansive, but the ceiling was still more than 5 meters high. A tall, narrow window was located at the 3-meter mark, letting the daylight shine in on the unpolished obsidian walls. The rough walls were adorned with tapestries, swords, and shields, a deep scarlet that Richard couldn't distinguish from dried blood. The room itself was still dark, blurring his sight even at midday without a lamp. He could feel a sinister aura radiating from every corner of the room as he lay in bed. There was also the fire flowing in his veins, something the two maids had started. They'd been secretly giggling amongst themselves during the bath, but the smart boy had been aware of their special intentions. With both the gloomy cold and searing heat affecting him, Richard's thoughts grew even more chaotic. Ever since he'd left Rusland, nay, ever since the Enlightenment ceremony that fateful night, everything had felt like a dream. The world right now just seemed so unreal. He finally heard a knock on the door while he was lost in thought. It was time for dinner, and he was taken to a dining hall within the castle that was quite a distance from the guest room. As he followed the maid to the place, Richard's only impression of the place was that it was large and dark. All the buildings were extremely tall, to the extent that even though the long, winding passageway was illuminated, it couldn't cast light on every single corner. It left silhouettes looming across the castle amidst the swaying shadows and pitch darkness that normal sight couldn't pierce through. At the center of the castle was an outdoor area he'd passed before, with the vegetation casting flickering shadows that messed further with his vision and caused him to tense up involuntarily. A faint odor seemed to be diffused throughout the castle, lingering behind and clinging onto him with every step he took. It made him feel repulsed and uncomfortable from the depths of his soul, a disgust that he couldn't express in words. The dining hall he was led to wasn't the largest in Blackrose Castle, but its size was still befitting of even a duke. The hall was 15 meters tall, extremely lofty and gloomy in spite of the torches lining the walls. Their light could hardly illuminate the mural on the domed roof. The table was 20 meters long, and Richard sat upright at one end dressed in the attire of a young noble. He was facing his father across the table that could serve up to 30 people at once. His father was an oddly charismatic man, with a smile on his face. His hair was combed back so neatly that not a single strand was loose, forming an indispensable part of his face alongside his short, thick mustache. Time had already left a noticeable mark on him, fine wrinkles creeping along the corners of his eyes. Those emerald orbs were clear and pure, but those who gazed upon them would feel like they were staring into an abyss. Sat there casually, he skillfully sliced the roasted lamb chops on his plate as he ate in quick bites, sipping on the red wine on occasion. His actions were strangely rhythmic. In fact, even the most fussy etiquette trainer wouldn't be able to pick out any slip-ups in his actions. Of course, he was eating too quickly, and too much, but his elegance made it hard to notice the several kilograms of lamb vanishing in a few breaths. Richard couldn't deny that Gatton was very graceful and charming, even as he wanted to smash the silver plate in his hand into the man's face. It would be a while before he learnt of the sheer number in that same camp. But for now he had to bear with it, not for himself, but for his mother. He still didn't understand the implications of his mother's wish, but his unwavering determination, patience, and wisdom let him know that he'd understand its profound meaning in the near future. Little Richard tried his best to sit with his back straight, and handled his food clumsily. The feast laid out in front of him was sumptuous. The delicacies by the huge kitchen of the Black Rose Castle were renowned, and the kitchen crew was made up of the best rôtisseurs and pâtissiers in the entire peninsula. However, he didn't at all know how to appreciate the food he had put in his mouth. He hadn't received etiquette training, and one would be able to tell that he came from the countryside just by looking at the way he gripped his fork and knife. He had no clue about table manners. However, Richard looked very handsome after his change of clothes, and his composed melancholy greatly resembled Gatton's own. Quite a few amongst the streams of maids entering and leaving the room cast secret glances at the adolescent who'd grow into his manly charm in a couple of years. After gracefully yet miraculously polishing off over 20 kilograms of lamb chops, Marquis Gatton finally wiped his mouth clean with a snow-white napkin and smiled. His huge mouth revealed 2 rows of dazzling white teeth. "You are Richard." Richard merely nodded, and didn't say a word. He could tell that Gatton was using a narrative tone, and that sentence didn't need to be answered. Gatton smiled. "You're quite fortunate to be in our Karen. You're also quite unfortunate, for the very same reason." Richard lifted his head and met Gatton's gaze. He said calmly, "My name is Richard, Ut." Gatton's gaze was as clear as water, yet few could look at him in the eye. Yet, Richard had held his head up high and didn't retreat even by the slightest bit. Gatton laughed, before exclaiming, "You're quite like your mother." "But she never mentioned that your name was Richard Ragabar?" Although it was a question, he said it as though he was making a statement, just like before. Little Richard hesitated for a while before speaking. "That's right." Now, he had more or less understood a little of his mother's intentions. "So, your surname is still Arcaren, regardless of whether you acknowledge it or not?" Gatton said. At this point, he had already finished eating the main course. 10 maids stepped forward with a wave of his hands, clearing out the dishes he'd polished off like a stream. They replaced the silverware with brand new ones, and served 7 dishes for dessert. Gatton devoured the dessert once more with the same elegance and speed, speaking at the same time. "Allow me to digress. Even the most experienced nobleman would be unable to pick out a flaw in my posture, but those old-school nobles still think that I am part of the nouveau riche. Yet there's this prominent figure we call Bloodthirsty Philip, someone whose favorite dish is raw demon meat that's less than an hour old normally. The only exception he makes is to extend it to a day for rare breeds. On top of that, he likes to tear the meat apart with his own 2 hands before he eats. Still, the old people think he's the true role model of all nobility. Do you know why?" Richard shook his head. The world of nobles was an unknown to him, what little information he did have coming from Mordred on their trip. The knight clearly wasn't a qualified tutor. Because this Philip is the great emperor of our sacred alliance. His imperial majesty wields formidable power and is very temperamental, so the older noble houses don't wish to infuriate him. There's benefits to having someone so big in their circles, and the hefty benefits are irresistible. Richard understood a little of the explanation, so he nodded. You are unfortunate to be an Archaran. You must grow strong and powerful, making the world your paradise, for without strength only hell awaits you in every corner. You won't have to bother about whether you grew up in the mountains or were born in the most magnificent and majestic of castles. You won't have to put on an act like I am now, those are all meaningless illusions. You only need to become formidable. You are an Archaran, and Archaran blood courses through your veins. As long as you carry this family name, people will look at you with hopes and expectations, placing you on a pedestal unlike any other. If you are only a tad bit stronger than the ordinary person, you will disappoint everyone. Gatton's voice grew louder as he spoke, and by the end of his speech his words were like thunderclaps resounding in Richard's ears, so much so that the boy started to grow dizzy. He gripped tightly onto the cutlery in his hands as he blankly turned towards the man who continued to maintain impeccable poise despite his volume. He couldn't care less about the piece of food that had rudely fallen from the tip of his fork and onto his plate. Gatton suddenly restrained his thundering voice, and revealed the charming smile once more. As long as you possess enough power, you can do anything you please, regardless of whether it has any meaning or no matter how absurd it is. Just like this. As he said that, Gatton called upon a maid and grabbed the clothing in front of her chest. He ripped her entire assembly apart with ferocity, instantly revealing her bare, naked body. The maid instinctively cried out in fear, but immediately choked back the shrieks that were about to follow. She obediently placed her hands on either side of her body, without the slightest intentions of covering up her exposed breasts and abdomen. The butler, some male servants, and guards and knights were also present in the dining hall, leaning against the wall like statues. Mordred, who'd brought Richard over from the village, was amongst their ranks. They all seemed to come to life at that moment. Even though they remained in standard position, there was no doubt that their eyes were all over the maid's body. She wasn't considered extremely beautiful, but her youth gave her a body brimming with attraction. Richard was dumbstruck, the scene almost too much for the 10-year-old to handle. The toughness he'd trained in since his youth took effect, however, as he held firmly onto the cutlery in his hands to ensure that it didn't fall out of his grip. The maid only dared to gather her clothes after Gatton waved his hands, but she didn't dare cover her body. She curtsied as she maintained normal posture, retreating from the hall while still facing her masters. She only dared to turn around after she reached the hallway, afraid that she'd meet with more misery if she ran away without courtesy. Indeed, Gatton's voice sounded from behind her. I originally wanted to kill someone for you to see, Richard, but I was in a bad mood a while ago, so I killed everyone I could get rid of. The other nobles had planted some moles in here. A pity I couldn't control my temper when I found out. Richard turned pale. How could one speak of murder so easily, in such a frivolous tone? Yet, the expressions of everyone in the dining hall remained the same, from the servants to the knights. It was as though what their master just said was as common as him hunting for animals and serving them up with vegetables. It was then that Richard became vaguely aware of what exactly that faint odor permeating the castle was. It was the stench of blood, accumulated over months and years. Just like he with the main course, Richard couldn't appreciate the dessert even as he finished it. He tried his best to resist the churning in his stomach, a grueling task to prevent the food he'd just eaten from rushing up his throat. The smell grew more distinct once he realized its origins, lingering at the tip of his nose. However, Richard ate quite a bit. He was in puberty, and children who grew up in the mountains were used to eating more. Gatton was rather satisfied. Eat more, so that you'll grow quickly. Richard, did your mother have any wishes that she wanted you to fulfill? Richard's expression changed. His silence was an affirmative, but he had no intentions of telling Gatton about them before they'd become reality. Gatton didn't press Richard any further, merely saying, "No matter what your mother's wish is, achieving it is probably no easy feat. I will not assist you directly, nor grant you any power, but I will give you enough chances to grow stronger. As for how far you will go, it all depends on you. I hope that one day, you'll be able to speak loudly to me." Richard nodded, but didn't speak. Gatton muttered to himself for a while, and said, "I'll get you a teacher, and you'll spend the next few years with her, learning. I hope you'll give me a pleasant surprise the next time you return. Not just for me, but also for yourself, and for your mother. That's all for tonight. Now go meet your brothers and sisters, it'll be very meaningful." But Richard didn't understand what Gatton meant until half an hour later. Still, it would take him a few more years to understand the deeper significance behind this truly profound experience. He'd been on a high-backed chair in the meeting, as stiff as a statue. His gaze had been tilted up a little, fixed on a mural above the door. The meeting had taken place in a small drawing room in the inner part of the castle, located in a different wing from the dining hall that was meant only for the family to use. The grand, lavish decorations here greatly contrasted the rest of the castle, warm and bright with light from illumination spells making it as bright as day inside. The numerous candles and the gorgeous holders added a perfect warmth to the room aside from the lighting as well. Richard's siblings were seated on couches to either side of him, 2 younger brothers and 6 sisters of various ages. He'd never imagined that he had so many half-siblings. When his cousins were added on, this number would probably grow. His brothers were seated on his left, and his sisters on his right. He was right in the center, bearing their scorching looks as they watched him attentively, like a rare demon just waiting to be dissected. Unlike the statue that was him, his siblings were much more unbridled and arrogant. The 2 boys were much younger than Richard, but their gazes were filled with explicit curiosity, contempt and hostility, everything but affection. Their stares made the hair on Richard's neck stand, which only happened when he could feel murderous intent. His 6 sisters were all of different ages. The eldest proved to be a young lady judging by her swelling bosom, and the youngest was likely less than 5 years old. The looks they gave him were much more complicated as well. There was inquisitiveness, but also hesitation as they scrutinized him. The 2 oldest were huddled together, discussing in low voices and glancing over at him from time to time as they occasionally erupted into unbridled laughter. Richard still couldn't understand what it was, only that it was definitely of no concern to their brothers and younger sisters. It would take some time for him to realize that it was what women did to men they wanted to sleep with. Richard didn't speak a word. He didn't know what to say at all, and his siblings didn't seem intent on conversation either. They leveled their constant, piercing gazes at him, some filled with such pointed callousness that they threatened to stab a hole through him, while others radiated a hatred like they wanted to devour him whole. They only met for 10 minutes, but to Richard it felt like an extremely long day had passed by the time the butler brought him out of the drawing room. He discovered the dress shirt he was wearing underneath his clothes was already drenched. He later realized that the 10 minutes in which he met his siblings was actually a sort of ceremony that represented their approval of him as part of the Arcarans, and that he would be part of the family from now on. Such a ceremony also allowed the members of the Arcaran family to get to know each other, giving them opportunities to select each other in the future. Richard departed Blackrose Castle the next noon, escorted by a small party of troops as he headed west. He hadn't seen Gatton again since dinner, and his father hadn't come out even when he left Azen. The meeting was simpler than he had imagined, and also much more cold and indifferent. He hadn't had any expectations in the first place, but he still felt a vague sense of loss when he left. The number of siblings made him understand that he was just another child to his father. However, Richard secretly clenched his fist so hard that his fingernails scraped his palm. 2 scenes superimposed themselves in front of his eyes. One was of his numerous siblings, and the other was the raging flames that continued to burn that day. He suddenly felt that his mother died such an unjust death. The team headed west, with Mordred still being Richard's escort. The knight spoke much less this time, only adding a few sentences in on occasion for the 20-day journey. They passed through dark forests, crossed the Roman River that stretched across continents, trudged along the Pale Mountain ranges for another 10 days, then passed through the territories of a dozen nobles and even a grand duchy before they finally arrived at their destination, the Deep Blue, a magical tower in the territory of the legendary Grand Mage Sharon. Space possessed power of its own. An immensely vast space will always exert some kind of actual pressure on people. Standing in front of the Deep Blue, Richard truly understood how vast a magical tower more than 500 meters tall could be. This wasn't just a standalone structure, but an entire complex of buildings extending from the Everwinter Mountains to one of the tributaries of Flow Bay. The central building was built in Gothic style, its flying buttresses adorned with complicated and exquisite carvings. An eye-catching spire and pointed arches supported the door, while colorful clouds of elemental particles and arcane energy encircled the peak. The entire magical tower seemed to be floating up towards the sky. Richard met Sharon quickly. This was a legendary mage, a guardian of the Sacred Alliance, and the instructor his father had chosen for him. Only face to face with the Dragonslayer did he realize that she hadn't even agreed to coach him. The journey was entirely his father's wishful thinking. Richard now stood in Sharon's magical hall, which was a dreamlike space. The walls and the ground were made of some unknown, sparkling material that was a translucent navy blue. One would be able to peer into the depths of the hall with one glance, but it also felt as though they couldn't look beyond the surface. Multicolored optical discs whirled around the walls and the floor from time to time, moving freely like a bunch of fish frolicking around, as agile as though they were alive. A throne carved out of an entire chunk of natural crystal stood atop a platform at the end of the hall, Sharon herself seated on it. Her feet were on the same level as Mordred's chin, and over Richard's head she was literally lofty. But with her legendary status, no one would think she was lacking in manners whatsoever. Sharon's golden hair flowed freely, and her long regal dress with a plunging neckline revealed her bare shoulders and much of her snow-white bosom. Her complexion was unbelievably fair, and one would have an urge to bite any part of her body if they saw it. Of course, one would choose to lay their teeth upon her full chest if they had a choice, and next would be her face. She seemed 17 or 18 at most, with a small face and quiet disposition. The Grand Mage was the definition of a classic beauty, seated atop the towering crystal throne like a goddess that had just descended. Those who met her for the first time would totally be unable to associate such a young and beautiful woman with a legendary mage. But even the youngest mage would know that the Deep Blue had been around for more than a century. Her hands were crisscrossed upon her knee, and every single finger was adorned with a long fingernail guard forged from enchanted adamantine, each finger embedded with gems and designs of every color. The designs on the guards were in fact formed from tiny spells inlaid in the myriad of gems that included rare stones only seen in legends. Those who knew value would be able to see that these guards were all impeccably powerful magical transmitters, or perhaps they were more like godly tools, and Sharon could actually cover all 10 of her fingers in them. Her earrings, necklace, and even the string that she used to tie her hair were magic transmitting equipment similar to the fingernail guards. The crystal throne was so dazzling that even Richard, a child who knew nothing about it, could tell how precious it was. However, this magic hall itself was worth 100 times the throne. The crystals built into the walls and floors were actually used by mages for their staffs. Standing in the magical hall, Richard suddenly felt his range of perception expand substantially, and traces of energy had started to enter his body as though they were flowing along some strange passageway. When the fine energy particles entered his body and were gradually absorbed, he suddenly heard the sound of glass shattering in his consciousness. It was as if some protective screen had been smashed into pieces at that very moment, allowing his perception that was once bound and restricted to dissipate completely. In the next second, Richard came into contact with a magical ocean. Undercurrents ebbed and flowed in this water void of light, flowing along the seabed, ready to silently devour a gigantic whale at any moment. If Richard fell into this ocean, he would instantly be engulfed without a single ripple, but he was standing on its surface at this very moment. The momentary feeling of confusion immediately made Richard turn pale, and he began to tremble involuntarily. It all felt so real, and it was beyond his abilities to determine if it truly was. Meanwhile, Mordred and Sharon were having a serious discussion about Richard's tuition fees. "It is my master's wish that you put your heart and soul into guiding our young master, on account of old-time sake." "Old-time sake? Yeah, I recall now. That Marquis from your family still hasn't paid me for many of my materials." "He has already paid the principal amount, hasn't he? How about the interest?" Discussing numbers with a mage was not a wise move at all. Mordred immediately changed the topic, and threw out Plan B. "Young Master Richard has an exceedingly outstanding innate gift for magic. Dozens of geniuses approach me to learn magic from me every year. I've even rejected 3 to 4 clerics." With a solemn face, Mordred dealt his trump card. "Our young master has the bloodline of the Arcarans, and few adults can compare to the degree of purity of his blood. Well, at least no one else among this generation of Arcarans is his match." The legendary mage was initially calm, but her eyes suddenly lit up so bright that the entire magical hall twinkled a little, as if she had seen an enormous dragon made of jewels. Although she spoke in a composed manner, anyone would be able to tell that she was just putting on an act. "Then what can I do?" "You can trample on him any way you wish." This didn't sound like something that solemn and old-fashioned Mordred would say. As a matter of fact, these were the exact words of the Marquis, not him, but Mordred maintained a solemn expression even as he said those words. Or perhaps his appearance didn't convey his emotions. It was then that Sharon and Mordred both became aware of Richard's peculiar behavior. Sharon looked as though she was in deep thought. "This little chap could actually establish a connection with my magical hall's magic power reservoir. That isn't an easy feat. Well, I guess he barely qualifies to learn from me," she said slowly. "Of course." Mordred smiled, but he was thinking otherwise. This was a magical hall constructed entirely out of abyss crystals. The magical powers here were so strong that even a knight like himself, whose only capability were his fighting abilities, could detect it. What's so hard about that? This excuse was really too far-fetched. However, that is not enough. Sharon said, "The 2 planes that Gatton has with him are pretty good. I want 10 years of his profits from either one of them." "In plane time?" "No, Norland time." The corner of Mordred's mouth twitched a little, but he eventually nodded. This had already slightly exceeded the baseline that Gatton had set for him, but it was still narrowly acceptable. Norland wasn't the sole plane in this world, but it was one of the top few. The time flow here was slower than in most secondary planes, and 10 years in Norland could be equivalent to centuries elsewhere. The bottom line that the Marquis had initially set was already unimaginably generous. This was half of Gatton's earnings that they were talking about, which would inevitably affect his plans for expansion in the future. One must know that Gatton's next goal was to establish his presence in the capital city of the Empire, the legendary city, Faust. In order to establish one's ground in such a place, no matter how abundant the resources prepared were, it would never be too much. It was only then that Mordred recalled a title that the elites in the Alliance secretly circulated among themselves, one which was prefixed to Sharon's name, Bloodsucking Sharon, indeed. Her maxim was widely known as well: "I might not be the strongest, but I will definitely be the wealthiest." However, Sharon continued, "I'll help little Gatton a bit during the next prayer to the Eternal Dragon." Mordred heaved a sigh of relief. This was unanimous with the baseline that Gatton had set. Yet he immediately felt a bizarre feeling rise in him. Although this was such a significant matter, both parties had quickly reached a deal at their baselines without probing each other numerous times in the push and pull process of haggling over prices. What chemistry they had. The most important task had already been successfully accomplished, and Mordred departed immediately. Right before he left, he couldn't help but turn back and take a last glance at Richard, with a complex look in his gaze. When more than a century worth of aggregate profits from a certain plane were stacked together, regardless of what shape or form, anyone would look back at them like that. Sharon waved gently. 18 mages all above level 12 immediately retreated without a noise, leaving her alone with the boy who was straining himself not to get overwhelmed by the magic power. Although his clothes were thoroughly drenched in sweat, Richard still braced himself and didn't collapse. The tenacity that he had been training since his youth was finally revealing its effects. The legendary mage sitting atop the crystal throne lightly tapped her fingers, and two of the fingernail guards collided with a ding. As the tides of the magic power reservoir hidden underground slowly came to rest, the rich and never-ending illusions in Richard's mind also vanished. When the tides were all focused upon little Richard, even someone with no talent for magic could display an extraordinary innate gift. This was a tiny disguise that Mordred definitely saw through, and Sharon had no intention of covering it up. It wasn't that she didn't have more superior and obscure strategies and excuses, just that she was too lazy to use them. No matter how botched a reason was, it was still a reason. Even if Mordred saw through Sharon's tricks, he didn't dare to mention it. That was the crux of the matter. Richard calmed his breathing and slowly raised his head to meet Sharon's gaze. He was a little startled. Although Sharon was high and mighty, her imposing loftiness was far more powerful and dangerous than the fiercest demon he had ever seen. This woman only looked about 17 or 18, and was so stunningly beautiful with her fair skin and a full chest that one would itch to sink their teeth into. She was going to be his teacher from now on? Your father has already sold the next few years of your life to me. The legendary mage used the word sold in a very ambiguous manner, knowing that Richard wouldn't be able to understand it clearly since he didn't have the listening skills of a level 7. Even if he heard it distinctly, he wouldn't understand what it meant for now. While the great magic tutor and the murderous maniac were negotiating over the price, this young man was struggling to endure the tides of the magic power and prevent himself from being washed away, clueless about everything else that was happening. From today onwards, you will be my student. You must execute all my orders accurately without fail, regardless of what they are. Sharon's voice was stern and distant. Yes. Richard replied. He had already learnt the responsibilities and obligations of an acolyte on the journey here. Sharon tapped her fingernails together once more. Two powerful mages entered the place and took him away. He maintained his display of respect and humility as her acolyte, not raising his head to look at her because it would be impolite. That's why he didn't notice the strange looks being shot at him from the cold beauty, the look bears gave salmon as they salivated with greed. It wasn't easy for Sharon to wait until the entire hall cleared out. She might have just erupted into laughter involuntarily moments ago, an unconcealable delight on the legendary mage's pretty little face as she unrolled an enchanted scroll in one swift motion. The scroll projected an image that formed a three-dimensional magic map, filled with innumerable magic symbols that indicated hundreds of planar coordinates. Sharon was in high spirits as she scanned through the dozens of dragon signs on the map of the plane. Since she was in a good mood, she decided to pillage a few dragon nests to celebrate the day's events. What should I do tonight? Rob a dragon, or rob a dragon, or rob a few dragons? The beautiful legendary mage was distressed in her own way. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 8. Examination. The work of art that was the Deep Blue's central tower wasn't constructed in the normal way. It was more than thrice the height and twice the width of an ordinary magic tower, adding up to a 12-fold increase in surface area. And this was excluding its large subsidiary building complex. The total of the resources used in constructing it was unimaginable, allowing it to house more than 10,000 people in its premises. With its large population, the Deep Blue on its own was on the level of a small city, but to be more specific, it was a large monster. The amount of resources sent in and out of it every day was worth tenfold its size. Sat atop a hill near the sea, the Deep Blue had its own harbor to move supplies, docks pulled up from the solid bedrock of the sea using magic. At least 3 large roads connected to the different entrances to the Deep Blue from this port, and 50 to 60 small towns prospered from the trade these roads established. The Deep Blue was situated at the apex of Flow Bay in the northwestern part of the continent, an estuary of two large rivers. The bay itself was as large as an ocean, spanning more than 1,500 kilometers from the Starlight Peninsula to the northern Everwinter Mountains. The bay froze over in the winter, leaving only the southernmost parts of the coastline open for business. The Deep Blue's own harbor was located near some warm currents, though, so it was ice-free. The Deep Blue was located in a prime location. Transportation was convenient, and it guarded one of the three main roads at the south of this icy continent. The only other option for the Grey Dwarves and mystical beasts in their attacks was to pass through Sunset Canyon, which was a 1,000-kilometer detour that forced them through the Thunderlord stronghold of the Sacred Alliance. Still, they would rather do that than try and force their way through Sharon again. War after war with the Deep Blue had put them in their place, and the woman was already on par with the most terrifying demons of their legend. When she officially entered level 20 and became a legendary mage, the Deep Blue had grown completely peaceful. Even the fierce, brutal, and valiant Grey Dwarves of the underground didn't dare destroy its serenity, allowing the surrounding lands to prosper. That was how an old mage that was well into his 90s told the story to Richard. His abilities weren't considered spectacular at level 8, and he was in fact amongst the weakest Richard had ever seen in the Deep Blue, but he was extremely good-looking with an alluring voice and an understanding of this land that was second only to Sharon herself. His job was simple. He was to explain the history of the Deep Blue to visitors and new acolytes like Richard, something deemed more important than the mana and talent examinations. One's talented magic determined how far a mage could travel the various paths of magic in this complicated world, while mana determined whether they could even attempt to become a mage at all. As a hand-picked student of Sharon's, Richard was different from the rest. What normally only took a single day had been extended to 3, a challenge not only for him but also for the old mage who had to spread the tower's history over the span of 3 days. Many details were missing from the old man's story, and some parts had been intentionally left out. However, one could only choose to accept and learn from the rich vaults of history, or forget about it as a whole. It was all for the sake of knowledge, and Richard had managed to piece together a quite complete image with his blessings. The 3 days of brainwashing seemed to be effective nevertheless, as Richard no longer looked at Sharon as an innocent, delicate girl. His desires for her diminished, replaced by a lack of vocabulary to describe this woman whom even the Grey Dwarves feared. Of course those weren't the mage's original intentions, but he wouldn't know how his teachings affected the student either. Everyone knew Richard to be a quiet kid who hardly expressed his feelings, never laughing nor crying despite reprimands and bullying. He did as he was told to the best of his abilities, and there was almost nothing to nitpick about in this 10-year-old who did not act like his age. Richard hadn't seen the sun in 3 days as his history lessons sped by at lightspeed. The next thing he knew, he was being brought to a special hall that was filled to the brim with alchemic tools and equipment. At least 20 mages were present here, with one main conductor who was the most superior. When Richard tried to use truth to see through him, all he saw was an appallingly huge flaming ball of magic instead of the mage himself. He was at least level 17, a great mage, strong enough to be appointed as the imperial magician of any kingdom, yet here he was conducting an examination. Richard removed his clothes, and was tied into a freezing metallic chair with all sorts of ropes and bandages. The conductor placed crystal needles in his body, an excruciating process that the boy endured silently. Just the scale of this part told Richard this examination would be no small matter, but he didn't know the full extent of it yet. The examination for a common acolyte was just the casting of a grade 0 spell on a crystal ball, but these mages treated it like an important experiment, exuding a solemn tidiness and the agility unique to powerful mages. Richard didn't know Sharon was sitting behind the enchanted one-way wall, supervising the entire process from the comfort of a sofa. One hand held the notes of a legendary mage, while the other sent fruits into her mouth every now and then. Still, nobody could predict someone of her power. She could still control the entire situation at ease without sound or sight, so it only made sense for the mages in the lounge to put their utmost effort into examining Richard. There was only one master of the Deep Blue, and everyone apart from her was a servant or a slave. Most mages here strive to make her happy in order to receive better treatment.